Two Minds. Episode 1. The Two Machines. A hospital corridor at night. Two doors at the end of the hall. A doctor stands between them with a chart in her hand and 90 seconds to decide. The chart is full of numbers. Survival rates. A note from another physician. A warning written in language that sounds precise until a life depends on it. Her eyes move across the page, but she is not really reading anymore. She is choosing. In the close-up, the important thing is not her face. It is the pupil. It widens. Not because she wants it to. Not because she has decided to reveal anything. It widens because thought has a cost, and the body has started paying it. She turns left. Before we understand that decision, we need to understand the machinery that made it feel like a decision. Look at this face. You already know something about her. You know she is angry. You know you would not want to interrupt her. You may even have an instant prediction about what she is about to say next. You did not choose to know these things. You did not inspect the angle of her eyebrows, calculate the pressure in her jaw, or measure the narrowing of her eyes. The answer arrived whole, fast, effortless, confident. Now try something else. 17 times 24. You know what kind of problem this is? You know you could solve it. The answer does not arrive in the same way. You have to hold one number in mind, move to the next, carry something, check something, maybe start again. You can feel the difference. The face happened to you. The multiplication requires you. The answer is 408, but the answer is not the point. The point is that, in less than 30 seconds, you have experienced two different modes of thought. Psychologists often call them System 2. These are not brain regions. They are not two tiny people arguing inside your skull. They are names for two kinds of mental operation. System 1 is fast, automatic, always on. It reads faces, hears danger in a tone of voice, completes familiar phrases, flinches at sudden sound, and tells you that 2 plus 2 is 4. System 2 is slow, effortful, deliberate. It follows instructions, compares options, searches memory, performs calculations, and checks whether an answer that feels right is actually right. The person you usually think of as you, the one who reasons and chooses and explains, is closest to System 2. But System 2 is not always first in line. Most of the time, System 1 gets there first. And System 2 often arrives later, not like a commander, but like a press secretary. It explains what already felt true. In the late 1960s, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky began turning this private experience into a scientific method. They were not watching strangers make mistakes from a distance. They made the mistakes themselves. They invented questions, answered them intuitively, and then examined the answers like evidence at a crime scene. Their laboratory was often a walk through Jerusalem. Their instruments were ordinary questions. And the thing they kept finding was not that people are foolish. It was more interesting than that. People are economical. The mind spends effort only when it has to. And one of the strange achievements of Kahneman's early work was that he found a way to see that effort happen. Not by opening the skull, by looking into the eye. In a 1960s laboratory, subjects listened to strings of digits. 5, 2, 9, 4. Their task was simple to describe and difficult to perform. Add 1 to each digit, keep the sequence in memory, and report the result in rhythm. 6, 3, 0, 5. As the task grew harder, the pupil widened. With each step, the dark center of the eye opened further. At peak effort, it could be dramatically larger than it had been at rest. Then the subject gave the answer. The effort ended. The pupil contracted. For a moment, thought had become visible. That image matters because System 2 does not work for free. Checking costs something. Resisting an easy answer costs something. Holding a problem in mind costs something. And when effort has a price, the mind starts looking for discounts. This would be fine if System 1 were merely fast. The problem is that System 1 is also confident. In 1999, psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons asked people to watch a short video of two teams passing basketballs. One team wore white shirts. The other wore black. The instruction was simple. Count the passes made by the players in white. People focused. They counted. They tried to be accurate. And while they were doing that, a person in a gorilla suit walked into the middle of the scene, faced the camera, beat its chest, and walked away. About half the viewers did not see it. Not because they were careless, because they were paying attention. Attention is not a light that illuminates everything. It is a spotlight. Okay? And when the spotlight is aimed at counting passes, something obvious can walk through the dark. The most unsettling part is not that people missed it. The unsettling part is that many were sure they would not have missed it. We are not only blind to the obvious, we are blind to the fact that we are blind. That is the first lesson of the two machines. You do not have direct access to everything your mind is doing. You have access to the story it gives you afterward. Here is another test. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Let the answer appear. Do not calculate yet. Just notice what your mind offers you. For many people, the answer that appears is 10 cents. It is simple. It is fluent. It feels right, and it is wrong. If the ball costs 10 cents, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, the bat costs $1.10. Together, they cost $1.20. The ball costs 5 cents. The bat costs $1.05. Together, they cost $1.10. This problem is not difficult because the math is hard. It is difficult because an easy answer gets there first. System 1 sees $1.10, here's $1 more, and produces 10 cents. Then System 2 has a job. Check it, but checking takes effort. And if the answer feels good enough, System 2 often signs it without reading the document. The Tanbal problem does not show that people are bad at arithmetic. It shows something more intimate. It shows the moment when confidence replaces verification. It shows how an answer can be wrong and still feel clean. It shows that a mistake can enter your mind not as a suspicion, but as a fact. The two machines are not enemies. You need the fast one. Without it, every face would be a research project. Every sentence would be a puzzle. Every footstep on a dark street would require a committee meeting. System 1 keeps the world usable. It compresses experience into guesses, and most of the time those guesses are good enough. But good enough is not the same as true. And the modern world is full of situations where a guess that feels good enough can become dangerous. A court hearing, a market panic, a marriage, a vote. The same machinery that reads anger in a face can read intention into a stranger, skill into a confident speaker, danger into a vivid story, and certainty into a number it has not checked. That is where this series is going. Not into a list of tricks. Into the architecture of judgment. The question is not whether you can avoid System 1. You cannot. The question is whether you can learn to notice the moment when System 1 has already answered, and System 2 is only beginning to wake up. Return to the hospital corridor. The doctor is still in her hand. The chart is still in her hand. The two doors are still waiting. What looks, from the outside, like a single choice is actually a collision of processes. Recognition, memory, fatigue, trust, the face of a colleague, the number on a chart. The story that feels complete because the missing pieces are invisible. In this episode, you saw the first part of the machinery. Fast thought arrives before permission. Slow thought can check it, but checking has a cost. In the next episode, we follow that cost. We return to the pupil. We watch effort rise and collapse. And we ask what happens to a decision when the mind still has to choose, but the part of you that checks the answer is already tired. Two Minds. Episode 2. The Cost of Effort. Listen. 5, 2, 9, 4. Add 1 to each digit. Say the result aloud. Stay in rhythm. 6, 3, 0, 5. If you tried, you felt it. The narrowing. The strain of holding one number while transforming the next. The sense that your mind had become a small room with too many objects in it. If you did not try, if you let the numbers pass through you, that is also important, because the part of you that chose not to try is the subject of this episode. In the last episode, you learned that your mind runs two systems. One is fast, automatic, and always on. The other is slow, deliberate, and capable of checking the first. This episode is about a question the first episode left unanswered. What does the slow system cost? A hospital corridor. The same 2 doors. But this time, look at the chart in the doctor's hand. Numbers. A graph. Percentage she is not absorbed. Her pupil is already dilated, fully, unmistakably. She has been working. In the early 1960s, a young psychologist named Kahneman was looking for a way to see thought happen. Not to measure what people think. Not to ask them what they remember or believe. To watch the physical event of thinking, in real time, in the body, without the thinker's knowledge. He read an article by the psychologist Eckhart Hess, who had noticed something about the pupil. Hess reported that pupils dilate when a person looks at something interesting. Wider for attractive faces, narrower for unpleasant ones. Kahneman had a different idea. What if the pupil responded not to interest, but to effort? He recruited a graduate student named Jackson Beatty, and together they built a setup like an optician's exam room. The subject leaned into a chin rest. A camera photographed the eye every second. An infrared flash illuminated the pupil without the subject knowing. And from the next room, through a closed-circuit camera, Kahneman watched. The task was the one you just heard. 4 digits. Add 1. Report the answer in rhythm. As each digit was processed, the pupil widened. With every step, hold the previous digit. Transform the current one. Prepare for the next. The dark circle at the center of the eye grew larger. By the 4th digit, the moment of maximum cognitive load, the pupil had dilated by nearly 50%. The iris was visibly compressed, face was tense, the body was still. And then the subject spoke the answer. And in the space of a single breath, the pupil contracted. The effort was over. And the eye, the body, showed it before the mind even knew it had stopped working. When Kahneman and Beatty plotted the data, a shape emerged. It was the same every time, with every subject, with every task. Effort builds, it peaks, and then it falls. The shape was an inverted V. The rise was slow, the fall was fast, and the peak, the point where the most information was being held, transformed, and managed simultaneously, was the moment the body was working hardest. But there was something else. When the task exceeded the subject's capacity, when there were too many digits, too much to hold, the pupil did not keep dilating. It stopped. And then it shrank. The subject had given up. Not in words. Not with a signal. The eyes simply closed the aperture. Kahneman later described a scene that became one of the defining images of his career. He and Beatty would stand in the corridor, watching the projected pupil on the screen, while the subject worked in the next room. They could hear the metronome. They could see the dilation. And sometimes, in the middle of a mental multiplication or an ADD3 sequence, they would see the pupil suddenly contract. They would lean toward the intercom and ask, "Why did you stop working just now?" The answer, from inside the lab, was always the same. "How did you know?" To which they would reply, "We have a window to your soul." Kahneman made another discovery during the breaks between tasks. He was watching a subject's pupil during a casual conversation. No task, no pressure, just ordinary talk. And he was surprised by what he saw. Nothing. The pupil barely moved. The mundane exchange, listening, speaking, reacting, required almost no measurable effort at all. This was a eureka moment. The tasks they had chosen for study, ADD3, mental multiplication, were not typical of mental life. They were the extreme. The ceiling. Most of the time, the mind is not sprinting. It is strolling. Kahneman used the metaphor of his own daily walk through the Berkeley Hills. At 17 minutes per mile, a comfortable stroll, he could think freely. His mind wandered. He composed arguments. He solved problems. But when he accelerated, pushed toward 14 minutes per mile, something changed. His ability to think coherently degraded. At the fastest speed he could sustain, he could not think at all. Every resource was consumed by the act of moving. Self-control and deliberate thought draw on the same limited capacity. If you are using all of it to walk fast, there is nothing left for thinking. If you are using all of it to think hard, there is nothing left for self-control. This is not a metaphor. This is the architecture. In the economy of the mind, effort is a cost. And the mind, like any efficient system, gravitates toward the cheapest option. This is called the law of least effort. It governs not just physical action, but thought itself. As you become skilled at a task, its demand for energy diminishes. The brain recruits fewer regions. The pupil dilates less. Talent works the same way. Highly intelligent individuals need less effort to solve the same problem. The implication is uncomfortable. Laziness is not a moral failing. It is an engineering feature. The system is designed to conserve effort wherever it can. And when effort has a price, the mind will always ask, "Is the answer I already have good enough?" Usually, the answer is yes. In the 1990s, the psychologist Roy Baumeister designed a series of experiments to test what happens when the budget runs out. In one experiment, subjects sat at a table with two options in front of them: a plate of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, warm and fragrant, and a bowl of radishes. One group was told to eat the cookies. The other was told to eat only the radishes and to resist the cookies entirely. Afterward, both groups were given a difficult puzzle. The subjects who had resisted the cookies gave up significantly sooner. The act of self-control, of overriding the urge to eat the cookies, had depleted something. The budget was spent. Baumeister found the same pattern across settings: suppressing emotion, resisting temptation, making difficult choices. Each act of voluntary effort, cognitive, emotional, physical, appeared to draw from the same limited pool. He called it ego depletion. This finding was reported in dozens of studies. It became one of the most influential ideas in psychology, and it was one of the ideas that did not survive the replication crisis intact. In 2016, 23 laboratories across the world attempted to reproduce the core ego depletion effect using a pre-registered protocol. They found, collectively, that the effect was either absent or far smaller than originally claimed. The debate continues. Baumeister has argued that the replication protocols differed from his originals. Other researchers have proposed alternative explanations: not a drained reservoir, but a shift in motivation, a change in what the mind decides is worth the effort. What is not in dispute is the broader observation: mental effort is expensive. Cognitive load, being asked to hold too much in mind, makes people more impulsive, more suggestible, and more willing to follow the default. When the part of you that checks is occupied, the part of you that guesses takes over. A psychologist once described this with a phrase that has stayed with me: System 1 has more influence on behavior when System 2 is busy. and it has a sweet tooth. This is where the story of effort connects to a story about method. In episode 1, you met Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two psychologists who began collaborating in 1969 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Their method was unusual. They spent hours each day in conversation, inventing problems, testing them on each other, walking through the streets of Jerusalem at a pace that allowed thought to flow. Kahneman later wrote, "I did the best thinking of my life on leisurely walks with Amos. That is not a sentimental observation. It is a statement about the law of least effort. The walking pace that allows thought is the strolling pace, the pace that leaves the budget intact. Walk faster, and the thinking degrades. Sit still too long, and restlessness drains the same resources." The walk was not an accessory to their method. It was the method. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has a name for what happens when effort sustains itself without willpower, when the work is absorbing enough that self-control is unnecessary. He calls it flow. Flow is the exception to the depletion rule. It proves that sustained concentration is possible, but only when the task itself provides the motivation. When the motivation must come from willpower, the budget starts draining. Kahneman and Tversky may have spent 14 years in flow. Most of us are not so fortunate. In 2011, researchers published a study of over 1,000 parole decisions made by 8 Israeli judges over a 10-month period. The cases were presented throughout the day. Each hearing lasted an average of 6 minutes. The default decision, the one that required no written justification, no departure from the status quo, was denial. The researchers were looking for patterns. They found one. At the start of each session, just after a meal break, judges approved parole roughly 65% of the time. As the session wore on, the approval rate dropped. It dropped steadily, predictably, towards 0. After a meal break, it reset, back to 65%. After lunch, the same pattern. The shape of this graph is called a sawtooth wave. It is the shape of depletion. The sharp drops are the cost of decision after decision without rest. The sharp recoveries are the cost of a meal. Denial required nothing. The judge could deny parole by writing nothing, explaining nothing, changing nothing. It was the path of least resistance. Approval required engagement, reading the case, weighing the arguments, accepting responsibility for a decision that could go wrong. Each approval was an act of System 2, and by the end of each session, System 2, or whatever we want to call the capacity that makes careful decisions possible, had been spent. This study has been questioned. Some researchers have argued that the pattern may not be caused by fatigue alone. The order in which cases were heard, whether simpler cases clustered early in each session, may play a role. The strategies of defense attorneys, who might schedule their strongest cases after breaks, could contribute. The debate is ongoing. The effect is large, suspiciously large, some say, and the mechanisms are not fully resolved. But what is not in dispute is this: the quality of a decision can depend on when the decision is made, not on the facts, not on the law, not on the merits of the case, on the time of day and the contents of a meal. And the judges did not know. They believed they were evaluating each case on its merits. They were not aware that something in them, something measured not in arguments but in hours since the last break, was shifting the calculus toward the easier answer. They were blind to the machinery, and the machinery kept running. The pupil is a record, not of what you know, but of what you spent. Every decision you make has a price, and the decisions you make when the price has already been paid, when the budget is empty and the machinery has no fuel left for checking, those decisions are still decisions. They still feel considered, but they are not the same. In this episode, you learned what effort costs. The pupil widens, the body pays, and when payment is exhausted, the slow system stops checking, and the fast system, the one that was never tired, takes over. Fatigue is not the only way System 1 shapes your reality. Even now, rested, alert, paying attention, the fast system is doing something you cannot see. It is associating, linking words to emotions, faces to judgments, and experiences to stories you never asked it to write. Bananas, vomit. Something just happened in your body. You did not choose it. And the machine that made it happen is the subject of episode 3. Something happened. You didn't ask for it. You didn't decide to feel it. A mild current of disgust, or aversion, or the ghost of a sensation passed through you. And the instant you recognized it, the feeling was already gone. The machine had fired and moved on. In the last episode, you learned what it costs to think carefully. The budget runs out. The machinery defaults to the easier answer. But fatigue is not what happened just now. You were not tired. Your system too was rested, ready, paying full attention. And the machine still ran without your permission. In episode 2, you saw what System 1 does when System 2 is depleted. This episode is about something more fundamental. What System 1 does all the time, whether or not you are depleted, whether or not you are even paying attention, it does not gather evidence. It does not suspend judgment. It constructs the most coherent story it can from whatever fragments are available, and it delivers that story as fact. Go with your gut. What is the middle character? If you saw it in the context of the alphabet, you likely read it as B. If you saw it in the context of numbers, you likely read it as 13. The character, the actual mark on the screen, did not change. What changed was the story surrounding it. System 1 didn't read the middle character and then check the context. It read the middle character as context, absorbed the whole sequence at once and resolved the ambiguity before you were aware there was an ambiguity to resolve. You did not jump to a conclusion. The conclusion arrived. You were not involved. This is a small demonstration of something large. In 1941, a psychologist named Solomon Asch asked a group of subjects to evaluate a person they had never met. He gave them a list of 6 adjectives describing that person. He then asked a second group to evaluate the same person, same list, same words, same person, same qualities, different order. The first group liked the person. The second group did not. Intelligent at the top of a list colors everything that follows. The stubbornness reads as persistence. The impulsiveness reads as energy. Envious at the top does the opposite. The intelligence reads as cunning. The industriousness reads as calculation. The first impressions stalled the impressions that followed. The psychologist Edward Thorndike named this tendency in 1920. He called it the halo effect. It is not a bias that afflicts only the naive or the uncritical. It is structural. It is the way System 1 builds coherence. If the first piece of information is positive, it generates a story in which the rest is positive too. If the first piece is negative, everything that follows is contaminated. Kahneman experienced this himself. As a young professor, he graded essay exams. He would evaluate Essay 1 for all students, then Essay 3, and he noticed that students who had written a good first essay continued to benefit from it through every essay that followed. A poor second essay from a student he had already marked down was read as further confirmation of mediocrity. A poor second essay from a student he had already marked up barely registered. He was not grading essays, he was grading his first impression, over and over again. He changed his method. He would shuffle the papers so each essay was graded blind to the others. And the correlations between essays, the grades that had seemed so consistent before, fell apart. Here is a problem. Take your time. You have formed an opinion. Now consider this. You received only the prosecution's summary. You did not hear from the defense. You did not see the base rate of insurance claims among people of her profession. You do not know the insurance company's methods for flagging cases. You had half the information. Possibly less. But the opinion arrived anyway. complete and confident from incomplete materials. Kahneman has a name for this. He calls it WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. System 1 does not know what it doesn't know. It does not feel the absence of information as a warning. It feels nothing at all. It takes whatever is available, whatever has been placed in the light, and constructs the most coherent story it can from those materials. And the more coherent the judgment, the world is not presented to you in full. It arrives in fragments, through a narrow channel, filtered by attention and accident. What you judge, decide, and feel is not the world. It is the story your mind has written from the pieces that arrived. In 1950, the psychologist Harold Kelly ran an experiment that would become one of the field's most cited studies of first impression. One class received this description before meeting a guest lecturer. Another class received the same description with one word changed: cold, warm. One word. That was the entire experimental manipulation. Both classes then attended the same 20-minute lecture, with the same instructor, delivering the same content in the same way. Afterward, they were asked to rate him on a series of personal qualities. The students who had been told he was warm rated him as more considerate, more informal, more humane, and funnier. The students who had been told he was cold rated him as formal, distant, and self-serving. They had seen the same person do the same things. And here is the detail that makes this result more than a footnote. The warm students interacted with the lecturer voluntarily during question and answer at twice the rate of the cold students. The word had not merely changed their opinions. It had changed their behavior. It had changed what they were willing to do. One adjective. Before the person was even in the room. And the halo, the coherent story built from that single warm datum, filled every subsequent observation with its color. In 2005, the psychologist Alexander Todorov and his collaborator Charles Ballew showed participants photographs of the winner and runner-up of real U.S. Senate races. The participants had no idea who these people were. They were simply asked which of the two faces looked more competent. Their answers predicted the outcome of the election correctly in nearly 70% of cases. This was not a fluke. It replicated across races, across levels of government. A 1-second glance at two faces predicted electoral outcomes better than chance in the majority of cases. The implications are worth sitting with. Voters are not choosing policies. They are not evaluating records. A significant portion of electoral behavior in competitive democracies among informed citizens is driven by a snap judgment about facial competence that System 1 delivers in less time than it takes to form a word. Todorov was careful not to overstate the finding. Electoral outcomes are determined by many factors: incumbency, the economy, campaign spending, scandal. The face competence effect is strongest in races where voters have little other information. Obscure contests, low turnout primaries, candidates from outside the voter's own party. But that is precisely the condition under which most decisions are made. Not when we know everything, but when we know almost nothing, and the machine fills in the rest. By the early 1970s, Kahneman and Tversky had developed an unusual scientific method. They were not primarily interested in other people's errors. They were interested in their own. Their procedure was this: they would invent a problem, a statistical puzzle, a judgment scenario, a hypothetical choice, and they would both answer it. If they both gave the same answer, and that answer was wrong, they had found something real, not a quirk of one person's psychology, a feature of the machinery itself. Kahneman described this as a form of introspection at scale. We were the experimenters and the subjects, he wrote. We trusted our intuitions. We were confident, even when we were wrong. And we were wrong in ways that were entirely predictable. This was not false modesty. It was methodology. Because if two people of exceptional intelligence and training could be reliably fooled in a given direction, then the average person in the average street could be counted on to follow. System 1 does not respect intelligence. It does not respect training. It runs on the same hardware in every skull. Here is a problem. Deposit money. Withdraw cash. Open an account. Apply for a loan. Dispute a charge. These are all plausible answers, constructed rapidly, from the single word, bank. But let me change one thing. Something shifted. Perhaps bank is now a riverbank. Perhaps the action she is about to take is a protest. Perhaps she is meeting someone. The word hasn't changed. The probabilities, objectively, have barely changed either. But the story has changed, and the story changes everything. This is WYSIATI. At its sharpest, Kahneman calls it the narrative trap. The mind does not reason from base rates and statistical likelihoods. It reasons from the story it has been given. And once the story is set, once the fragment of context establishes a theme, every new piece of information is absorbed into that theme, not evaluated against it. Kahneman first encountered the most striking version of this effect, not in a laboratory, but in a classroom. He was a young lecturer at the Hebrew University, teaching statistics and psychological methods. His students were preparing to become educational counselors. Part of their training was the school interview. They would spend a short time with a child, assess them, and make predictions about their academic future. The students had been given a task. They would conduct their interviews, make their predictions, and then Kahneman would show them the data. He would show them how accurate their predictions had actually been. The data was humbling. The predictions were barely better than chance. But here is what interested Kahneman. When he told the students about their poor predictive accuracy, they accepted the information. They nodded. They understood. And then they went back to making their predictions with exactly the same confidence as before. The story the students built from each interview felt complete. It felt like knowledge. The statistical evidence that it wasn't, that it was largely confabulation, pattern matching on thin fragments, didn't touch that feeling. Because WYSIATI applies to self-knowledge, too. What you see in yourself is all there is. And what you see, when you look at a confident judgment you just made, is a coherent story. The fact that the story was constructed from insufficient materials does not reveal itself. The machinery does not leave footprints. There is one more mechanism at work in all of this. Kahneman calls it intensity matching, and it is one of the most quietly radical ideas in the book. Consider this question. Julie learned to read when she was 4 years old. How tall is she? This is a question with no rational answer. Reading age and height have no correlation. There is no information here about Julie's height. But a number came to mind anyway. Probably a number that sits toward the high end of the height distribution. Not extremely tall, just above average. Because reading at 4 maps to impressive in most people's minds, and impressive translates, automatically, without permission, to more than average on whatever dimension you are being asked to judge. This is System 1 performing what Kahneman calls a substitution. You are asked a question you cannot answer. How tall is Julie? And without your knowledge, your mind answered a different question. How impressive is Julie? It then translated the answer to that second question back into the units of the first. This is not a rare failure mode. It is the default operation. When a question is hard, the machinery substitutes an easier one. When a dimension can't be assessed, the machinery borrows a value from a dimension that can. It does this so quickly, so cleanly, so entirely below the level of awareness, that System 2 receives the answer as if it had been calculated, not substituted. The colleague is not lying. He is not incompetent. He is not incompetent. He has good intuitions built from many years of good practice, delivering a conclusion that feels like knowledge. His confidence comes from coherence, from the story that fit the pieces he had. He does not feel the missing pieces. He does not feel them any more than you felt the gaps in the jigsaw. What you see is all there is. and what he sees is confident. And what she sees, a confident colleague, a story that fits, a decision that feels already made, is enough. You have now seen three mechanisms: the two systems, the cost of effort, and the story machine that fills in what you don't know with what feels like what you do. In every case, the filling is confident. In every case, the confidence is independent of the accuracy. But here is what is coming. The story machine does not just fill gaps. It prefers some stories to others. It is drawn to familiar patterns, to fluent structures, to answers that feel easy to process. And when it is asked to judge the probability of an event, it does not calculate. It asks a different question entirely. Do not answer yet. The machinery that generates your answer, and the particular flaw it reveals about probability, is the subject of episode 4. A woman named Linda is 31 years old. She is single, outspoken, and very bright. As a student, she was deeply concerned with discrimination and social justice. Which is more likely? A. Linda is a bank teller. B. Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Do not answer yet. If an answer arrived immediately, and it did not arrive as arithmetic. It arrived as recognition. Option B feels like Linda. It sounds like her. It fits the picture your mind assembled from a handful of carefully chosen details. Option A sounds smaller, flatter, less complete. And that feeling of fit, that sense of B being somehow more like her, is the beginning of the problem. Hold your answer. We will come back. Same patient, same treatment, same number, but not the same sentence. The decision did not wait for the mathematics. The frame arrived first. Now answer the Linda question. Most people choose B, not because B is more likely. It is not. It cannot be. B contains A. Every feminist bank teller is already a bank teller, and then adds another condition. A subset cannot be larger than the whole. But that is not what your mind was judging. It was not comparing probabilities. It was comparing stories. Linda sounds like the sort of person who might be active in the feminist movement. The description is coherent. The fit is immediate. And coherence, to the machinery that built the answer, feels like truth. Kahneman and Tversky called this representativeness. When asked a hard question, what is more probable? The mind quietly substituted an easier one. What is more like the picture I already have? The substitution was so smooth you did not notice it happen. You were asked about probability. You answered about resemblance. And the answer felt like it was about probability. The conjunction fallacy is not a mathematical mistake made at the end of reasoning. It is a pattern recognition victory delivered at the beginning of it. Kahneman and Tversky built this trap in many forms. One of the best known involved a fictional student named Tom W. Tom was described as orderly, emotionally flat, more comfortable with systems than people, deeply interested in detail and precision. Participants were then asked to guess what Tom was studying. Computer science felt right. Engineering felt right. Library science felt plausible. Humanities felt wrong. The pattern was clear. But there was a second question hiding underneath the first. Not which field fits the portrait best, but how many students are in each field to begin with. Base rates. If you are on a campus where humanities students outnumber computer science students 5-1, then even a description that perfectly matches the computer science stereotype must be weighed against the fact that you are far more likely to encounter a humanities student on any given day. But that weighing did not happen. The description arrived as a portrait, vivid, specific, with a face. The enrollment statistics arrived as a number, and the portrait won. This is one of Kahneman's central findings. Statistics feel bloodless, while stories feel alive. When the two conflict, the story usually wins the first round. Here is a different problem. Take your time with it. A cab was involved in a hit-and-run accident at night. 2 cab companies operate in the city. 85% of the cabs are green, 15% are blue. A witness identified the cab as blue. The court tested the witness's reliability. She correctly identified each color 80% of the time. What is the probability that the cab was blue? You have formed an estimate. Most people answer around 80%. It feels right. The witness is 80% reliable, so the cab is probably blue. But that is not the correct answer. The correct answer is approximately 41%. The cab was more likely green than blue, even though the witness said blue. What happened? The witness is 80% reliable. That feels like a strong number, but there are far more green cabs than blue ones. The base rate, 85% green, matters enormously. Most of the cabs the witness calls blue are, in fact, green cabs misidentified. The reliable witness was overwhelmed by the base rate, and your mind, presented with both pieces of information, used one and discarded the other. This is the core of what Kahneman found. When a story and a statistic sit side by side, the story almost always wins. The witness said blue. That is a story, a person, a claim, a cause. The 85%, the fact that most cabs are green, is not a story. It is a number. And numbers, to System 1, are not real in the way that a person's testimony is real. But Kahneman and Tversky discovered something else about this problem. Something that changed the picture entirely. They ran the same problem with one change. Instead of telling participants that 85% of the cabs in the city were green, they said this: the 2 companies operate the same number of cabs, but green cabs are involved in 85% of accidents. Now participants used the base rate. Their answers shifted dramatically. The percentage of people who correctly accounted for the base rate more than doubled. What changed? The mathematics is identical. 85% of accidents involve green cabs. Whether that is because there are more green cabs or because green drivers are worse, the calculation produces the same answer either way. But the second version tells a story. Green cabs cause more accidents. Green drivers are reckless. The base rate is no longer a bloodless proportion. It is a character trait. It has a face. And System 1 can work with faces. System 1 does not ignore base rates because it cannot process them. It ignores them because they arrive in the wrong format. When a base rate is rewritten as a cause, as a property of an actor, as something that happens for a reason, it enters the story. And once it is inside the story, the machinery uses it. The lesson is not that people are bad at statistics. The lesson is that the machinery has a preferred language. And that language is causal, narrative, and vivid. It is the language of characters and intentions, not the language of proportions and denominators. Now consider a different statistical illusion. In the early 2000s, researchers mapped the counties in the United States with the lowest rates of kidney cancer. A pattern emerged. The counties were mostly rural, thinly populated, and remote. That pattern invites a story immediately. Clean air, quiet lives, local food, less stress. But the counties with the highest rates of kidney cancer were also mostly rural, thinly populated, and remote. Same counties. Opposite story. Both stories are wrong. The explanation is not pastoral virtue or hidden poison. It is sample size. Small populations produce extreme outcomes by chance alone. When the denominator is tiny, randomness swings harder. Some counties land unusually low, others land unusually high. Both extremes come from the same mathematics, the mathematics of insufficient data. Kahneman called this the law of small numbers, the persistent, intuitive belief that small samples faithfully resemble the larger population they came from. They do not. Randomness looks patterned when the sample is small enough. And the pattern machine, the part of you that sees faces in clouds and stories in noise, would rather invent an explanation than admit that chance has no face. Every basketball fan has seen it. A player hits 3 shots in a row, then 4. The crowd leans forward. The commentator says, "He's got the hot hand." In 1985, Tversky, along with Thomas Gilovich and Robert Vallone, studied the hot hand in basketball. He analyzed thousands of shots from the Philadelphia 76ers and the Boston Celtics. They looked for the pattern everyone could see. They could not find it. The probability of hitting a shot after 3 consecutive hits was the same as after 3 consecutive misses. The hot hand, as a statistical phenomenon, did not exist in the data. Players believed in it. Coaches believed in it. Fans believed in it. The feeling was overwhelming and unanimous, but the feeling was produced by the same machinery that saw cancer patterns in rural counties. The pattern machine looked at randomness, at the noise of athletic performance, and saw a story. There is a footnote to this story. In 2015, a pair of economists, Joshua Miller and Adam Sanjarjo, published a correction. They showed that the original 1985 analysis contained a subtle statistical bias, and that when corrected, a small hot hand effect does appear in the data. The debate continues. The effect, if real, is small, far smaller than what players and fans experience. The perception of the hot hand is real. The question is whether the reality matches the perception, or whether the perception is, as Tversky suspected, the pattern machine doing what it does best, finding signal in noise. In the 1960s, Kahneman was advising flight instructors at an Israeli Air Force base. During a seminar on the psychology of training, he made what he considered a simple point. Research had shown that reward is a more effective motivator than punishment. An instructor in the audience, experienced, weather-beaten, visibly skeptical, raised his hand. He said, "I've praised cadets after a clean maneuver, and the next time they always do worse. I've screamed at cadets after a terrible one, and the next time they always do better. So don't tell me that reward works better than punishment. The evidence says the opposite." Kahneman later described this as one of the most important moments in his intellectual life, because the instructor was right about what he observed, and he was completely wrong about why. Extreme performances tend to be followed by more ordinary ones, whether anything is done about them or not. An exceptionally good landing was partly skill and partly luck. The next attempt keeps the skill, but loses the luck. Performance drifts back toward the pilot's average. The reverse is equally true. An exceptionally bad landing was also partly luck, bad luck. The next attempt keeps the skill, but the luck normalizes. Performance improves, seemingly on its own. This is regression to the mean. It is a mathematical inevitability, not a psychological effect. But the instructor didn't see mathematics. He saw a sequence. I praised, performance dropped. I punished, performance improved. The sequence looked causal. And for System 1, a causal sequence is an explanation. The pattern machine does not distinguish between a cause and a coincidence that has the shape of a cause. Kahneman later wrote that this moment taught him something about the human condition that statistics alone had not. That we live in a world that punishes us for rewarding others and rewards us for punishing them. And it does this not because punishment works, but because of a statistical artifact that feels, to the person living through it, like a law of nature. The pattern machine hates unexplained variation. It turns fluctuation into narrative, and calls the narrative insight. By now, a pattern has emerged across the patterns. In each case, Linda, the taxicab, Tom W., the counties, the hot hand, the flight instructor. The same thing happened. System 1 was presented with 2 kinds of information. A portrait, a story, a streak. The other was statistical. a base rate, a sample size, a distribution. And in each case, the vivid information won. This is not because people are bad at math. It is because probability is a foreign language. System 1 does not think in distributions. It does not think in nested sets, conditional probabilities, or invisible denominators. It thinks in characters, causes, clean shapes, things that fit. Linda is vivid. Tom is vivid. A stereotype is vivid. A stereotype is vivid. A Mahatstrik is vivid. A base rate is not. So the pattern machine leans toward what is vivid, and it experiences that preference as understanding. Representativeness is useful in ordinary life. It helps you recognize a dog before you have counted its legs. It helps you see anger in a face before you have measured a muscle. In a world of objects, faces, and ordinary causes, resemblance is a reliable guide. It fails when the world is statistical. And modern life is increasingly, relentlessly statistical. In medicine, in law, in policy, in finance. The machinery that kept your ancestors alive in a forest is the same machinery that misjudges the taxicab, the cancer rate, and the flight instructor. This is why anecdotes beat aggregates so often, in the courtroom, in the newsroom, and in memory. A single vivid case arrives as a story. 1,000 cases arrive as a statistic. And System 1 trusts the story first. One witness, seen, heard, specific, outweighs an actuarial table in the minds of the jury. Not because they are ignoring the table, because the witness is a story and the table is not. And stories are the native language of the pattern machine. Numbers are the foreign one. Return to the hospital. The chart said 18% survival. It also said 82% mortality. If one sentence feels more hopeful and the other more fatal, nothing changed in the treatment. Nothing changed in the treatment. Nothing changed in the mathematics. Only the frame changed. But the frame is enough. By now, you have seen the pattern machine from several angles. It chooses the option that sounds most representative. It discards the base rate when a witness provides a face. It finds patterns in random streaks. It invents causes for regression. It trusts a single vivid case over a proper denominator. And when the world presents to mathematically identical descriptions, 18% survival, 82% mortality, it experiences them as different realities. The tragedy is not that she was irrational in some theatrical sense. The tragedy is that her machinery was normal. She saw a pattern. She felt a frame. She mistook the ease of processing for the quality of evidence. And because the pattern felt clean, the decision felt earned. The number you just saw has nothing to do with the question. But it is inside your answer now. In the next episode, we will ask how this happens. How a random number changes an estimate, how a price tag shapes a judgment, and how the first thing you see becomes the foundation of everything you think. 45. Do not do anything with it yet. Just let the number sit there. Now answer this. What percentage of the world's countries are in Africa? Do not look it up. Do not count. Just estimate. You have a number. It feels as though it came from you. That feeling is the trap. The correct answer is about 28%. Using the common count of 195 countries, 54 are in Africa. If your estimate was too high, it may not have been because you know less geographies than you thought. It may be because the first number in the room was 45. The number had nothing to do with the question, but it entered the answer anyway. Notice the order. You did not first ask yourself how many countries exist, then how many are in Africa, then divide one by the other. Most minds do not work that way under pressure. They search for something close enough to begin with. And because 45 was already lit up, it became easier to begin there than to begin from nothing. This is the anchoring effect. The first number, price, forecast, salary, risk, or vivid value that enters the mind becomes a hidden starting point. System 1 anchors on it. System 2 adjusts away from it. Then it stops too soon. And after that, confidence arrives to protect the estimate as if it were self-generated. Same doctor, same chart, same statistic. But the chart did not arrive into an empty mind. A different number got there first. In the early 1970s, Kahneman and Tversky brought a wheel of fortune into a psychology experiment. It looked random. It sounded random. The wheel clicked against its flapper, slowed, and stopped. But the wheel was rigged. It could only stop at two numbers, 10 or 6 to 5. Participants watched it spin. They saw the number. Then they were asked a question that had nothing to do with the wheel. What percentage of African nations are members of the UN? The wheel was obviously irrelevant. It did not contain information about African nations, international institutions, geography, politics, or anything else. People who saw the wheel land on 10 estimated, on average, 25%. People who saw it land on 65 estimated, on average, 45%. A 20-point difference. Moved by a wheel, number everyone knew was meaningless. This matters because awareness is not immunity. The participants did not think the wheel was a sacred oracle. They did not think the wheel was secretly measuring the United Nations. They knew it was random. But knowing that a number is irrelevant is different from removing its effect. The mind can reject a number as evidence while still using it as a starting point. That is the anchoring effect in its purest form. An arbitrary value enters the mind, and later judgment bends around it. Not completely, not visibly, but enough. The first explanation was simple. When asked for an estimate, people start from an anchor and adjust away. But adjustment is effortful. It belongs to System 2, and System 2 is not generous with effort. So the mind moves away from the anchor until the new number feels plausible. Then it stops. The stopping point feels reasonable. That is the danger. Reasonable is not the same as corrected. An estimate can feel considered and still be anchored. This is why high anchors produce high estimates, low anchors produce low estimates, and both groups believe they have adjusted enough. They have adjusted, just not far enough. The mind treats plausibility like a finish line. It is often only the first checkpoint. But anchoring is not only mechanical adjustment. A number can also prime the mind. Ask people whether Gandhi was more or less than 144 years old when he died. No one believes Gandhi lived to 144. The number is absurd. But it still activates a region of thought. Old age, longevity, endurance, a life stretched across time. Those ideas become easier to retrieve. And because they are easier to retrieve, the final estimate shifts upward. The anchor did not merely set a starting point. It changed what evidence felt available. Researchers showed the same effect with temperatures. A warm numerical anchor made summer words easier to bring to mind. A cold numerical anchor made winter words easier. They showed it with prices. A high-price anchor for a German car made luxury brands easier to think about. A low-price anchor made cheaper brands easier. The number changed the mental search. It did not need to be believed. It only needed to be encountered. This is why the phrase, just a number, is psychologically naive. A number can be false and still organize attention. It can be absurd and still activate a neighborhood of ideas. It can be visibly strategic and still define what counts as a reasonable response. When a number enters first, it begins selecting the evidence that will later seem to justify it. This is why numbers in the environment matter. A room full of numbers is not neutral. It is a room full of possible starting points. If anchoring only worked on students and laboratories, it would be a curiosity. It is not a curiosity. In one study, real estate agents evaluated a house. The house was the same in every condition. The square footage was the same. The neighborhood was the same. The comparable sales were the same. Only the listing price changed. The agent's estimates of fair value moved with the listing price. Higher estimate, low listing price, lower estimate. The anchoring index was 41%. That means the arbitrary listing price accounted for a large part of professional judgment. The students in the same study were influenced too. Their anchoring index was 48%. The professionals did better, but not by much. And the most revealing difference was not accuracy. It was awareness. The students admitted the listing price influenced them. The agents denied it. They pointed to the roof, the neighborhood, the floor plan, the market. They had reasons. The reasons were real. The starting point had already moved. This is the older confidence machine beginning to wake up. Once the estimate is formed, the mind does not experience it as the listing price plus some insufficient adjustment. It experiences it as a judgment supported by reasons. The floor plan becomes evidence. The neighborhood becomes evidence. The neighborhood becomes evidence after the anchor has already set the range. And because the reasons are coherent, the estimate feels earned. Anchors are everywhere. Money changes hands. A price tag is not just information about what a seller wants. It is a proposal for what the object should be worth in your mind. A sale price works because the original price is still visible. You do not experience the discount as an absolute price. You experience it as movement away from a number someone else supplied. The same pattern appears in salary negotiations. The first number on the table shapes the zone of possible agreement. Every later number becomes an adjustment from the first. And because adjustments are insufficient, the first mover often gets to define the room. This is why an extreme first offer can be powerful, even when everyone recognizes it as strategic. Knowing that a number is manipulative does not remove it from the mind. It only adds a second thought on top of the first one. System 2 says, ignore that. System 1 has already started from there. Salary negotiations are especially vulnerable because there is rarely a single obvious truth. A salary is not like the boiling point of water. It is a value negotiated inside a fog of market rates, self-worth, status, leverage, and fear. That fog gives the first number room to work. If the initial offer is low, later increases can feel generous while still leaving the final number below the relevant market. If the candidate's first request is high, the employer may reject it consciously while still adjusting from it unconsciously. The anchor does not decide the outcome by itself. It defines the path along which the outcome will move. The courtroom should be the opposite of this. Law is supposed to discipline judgment. Sager is supposed to protect decisions from irrelevant noise. But numbers still get in. In a study with experienced German judges, participants evaluated a shoplifting case after rolling loaded dice. The dice landed on either 3 or 9. Judges who rolled a 9 gave a higher sentence than judges who rolled a 3. The dice were irrelevant. The judges knew the dice were irrelevant. Still, the number moved the sentence. The same logic matters in civil cases. A large damages request can pull awards upward. A damages cap can limit very large awards while also making smaller awards orbit a larger number than they otherwise would have. The legal question has not changed. The reference point has. This is why legal numbers are never merely legal numbers. A demand, a cap, a sentencing recommendation, a settlement offer, a prior award, each can become the mental zero point from which later judgments move. Sometimes that is appropriate. Prior cases can discipline the imagination. Sentencing guidelines can reduce arbitrary variation. But when the number is poorly chosen, strategically inflated, or irrelevant to the case, it does not stop being powerful. It becomes powerful and dirty at the same time. The anchor does not need to be dramatic. It can be a small sign in a supermarket. In a grocery store experiment, shoppers saw a display of soup cans. One sign said, "Limit of 12 per person." Another version had no limit. Shoppers who saw the limit bought about 7 cans. Shoppers who saw no limit bought about 3.5. The word limit sounded restrictive. The number 12 still expanded the amount that felt normal. The same thing happens in charity. Ask for $5 and generosity shrinks. Ask for 400 and generosity expands. The donor may not give 400, but the ask defines the scale. A forecast can work the same way. If a headline says a company may be worth $1 trillion, every later estimate is pulled into the orbit of trillion. If an analyst says a recession has a 30% chance, the number begins to feel like a property of the future instead of a fragile model of it. If a poll shows a candidate leading by 9 points, the next poll is experienced as movement from 9, not as a fresh measurement with its own uncertainty. Anchors make dynamic things feel fixed. They turn uncertain landscapes into number lines. Even medical judgment can be touched by this. A risk estimate framed after a vivid number, a prior case, a badly chosen threshold, or a population average from the wrong group can become a starting point for a patient who is not actually represented by it. Imagine a doctor told that a treatment works in 45% of a broad population. Then imagine that the patient's actual subgroup has an 18% survival rate. Both numbers may be real. Only one may be relevant. The danger is not that the doctor cannot understand the difference. The danger is that the first number furnishes the room before the relevant number arrives. The later statistic has to fight inside a mind that already has furniture. Medicine needs numbers. But not every number in the room deserves to become a reference point. That difference is where judgment either becomes disciplined or contaminated. Not every anchor is poison. A useful reference point is relevant, explicit, and earned. The average sale price of similar houses is useful. The base rate for patients like this one is useful. The median salary for this role, in this market, with this experience level, is useful. A forecast built from comparable cases is useful. These numbers are not perfect, but they are disciplined. They tell you where to begin because they belong to the problem. A contaminating anchor is different. It arrives first, loudly, vividly, or accidentally. It may be arbitrary. It may be strategic. It may be true for another case and wrong for this one. It may be a price tag, a salary request, a plaintiff's demand, a charity ask, a forecast headline, a hospital threshold, or a number someone said while walking down a corridor. The mind often treats both kinds of number. It starts there. Then it adjusts. Then it stops too soon. The hardest cases are the mixed cases. A number can be partly relevant and partly misleading. A salary band can be real, but drawn from the wrong city. A house comparable can be nearby, but not actually comparable. A medical survival rate can be accurate for a broad population but wrong for a specific patient. A legal precedent can resemble the case emotionally while differing in the fact that matters. System 1 is not built to audit those distinctions. It sees a number with the right surface shape and treats it as a place to begin. The defense is not to pretend you can ignore anchors. You usually cannot. The defense is to choose the starting point before the world chooses one for you. Ask, what is the baseline? What is the reference class? What number would I use if I had not just seen this one? Was this anchor selected because it is informative, or because it was first? If the anchor is outrageous, do not negotiate with it as if it deserves a place in the calculation. Reject it. Reset the frame. Find a relevant reference point. Then adjust from there. This is not elegant. It is not intuitive. It does not feel like genius. It is closer to hygiene. You are cleaning the estimate before confidence has time to harden around it. There is another defense, more uncomfortable. Write down your estimate before you see the anchor, before the salary offer, before the list price, before the damages demand, before the forecast headline, before the medical threshold. The written estimate will not be perfect, but it gives system to a memory of where it stood before the room changed. Without that memory, the mind rewrites the path. It forgets the starting point was planted. It remembers only the final number and the reasons that gathered around it. Return to the hospital. The doctor believes she is estimating from the chart. But the chart did not arrive first. The first number was spoken in the corridor. 40%. Maybe 45? Then came the page. 18% survival. Different frame, different frame, different source. But now all of the numbers are in the same mind. The chart asks for a comparison. She has no time to perform. Is 45 a useful reference point or a contaminant? Is 18 a base rate, a frame, a warning, a hope, or a number from the wrong class? What would she estimate if the corridor had been silent? There is no time. She adjusts. She believes she has adjusted. She stops at a number that feels plausible. And because the number feels plausible, it begins to feel earned. That is the bridge to confidence. Confidence is not always a signal that the estimate is clean. Sometimes it is the feeling of coherence forming around a contaminated starting point. The first number got in. The adjustment was too small. Then coherence did the rest. In the next episode, we will follow that coherence, the machine that turns partial evidence into certainty and certainty into action. A startup has been operating for 2 years. It has a charismatic founder with a Stanford degree. Revenue has grown 40% year over year. It has received $12 million in Series A funding. 3 industry analysts have called it one to watch. Will this company be worth more than $100 million in 5 years? Rate your confidence. 0%, you have a number. You may not have said it aloud, but it formed. A percentage, a feeling of how sure you are. It may have been 70%, it may have been 40%, it may have been higher. Now consider this. Of all venture-backed startups that raise a Series A round, roughly 75% fail entirely. Of those that survive, fewer than 1 in 50 reach a $100 million valuation within 5 years. The description gave you a story, a face, a trajectory. The base rate gave you a denominator. Your confidence came from the story. The denominator never had a chance. But notice something else. You were not just wrong about the company. You were confident about being wrong. And that confidence, that feeling of clarity, is what this episode is about. She remembers his face. Michael. Ward 7, 3 years ago. Same diagnosis. Same experimental protocol. He walked out of this hospital. One patient. One name. One face she can see. The actuarial table in her hand has 400 cases. She has not looked at it. The Negev Desert. Early 1950s. 20 years old, barely older than the soldiers he is watching, sits at the edge of an obstacle field with a clipboard. His name is Daniel Kahneman. He's been assigned to the Israeli Army's psychology branch. His job is to evaluate which of these men will become officers. The test is called the Leaderless Group Challenge. 8 candidates, stripped of rank, wearing only numbered tags, must lift a long log from the ground and haul it to a 6-foot wall. The entire group must get over the wall with the log. The log cannot touch the wall or the ground. No one can touch the wall. If any rule is broken, they start over. As the men worked, their characters seemed to pour out of them. One took command, and the others followed. Another tried to lead and was ignored. A third gave up and hung back. Under stress, it seemed, each man's true nature was laid bare. The evaluations came easily. The confident leader would be a strong officer. The quitter would wash out. The arrogant one would be a liability. The quiet one who stepped forward when the group failed, he would surprise people. The predictions felt obvious. They felt like seeing. Every few months, the army provided feedback. The cadets they had evaluated were now at officer training. The commanders who watched them daily sent back their assessments. The story was always the same. The predictions were nearly useless. Not zero, but close. Their confident assessments of who would lead and who would fail bore almost no relationship to what actually happened. The soldier who dominated the obstacle field might have folded under live fire. The quiet one might have been the first to act when it mattered. They knew this. They were told this. They accepted it as a statistical fact. And the next morning, a new batch of candidates arrived. They went to the obstacle field. They lifted the log. And within minutes, the evaluators saw each man's true nature, as clearly and as certainly as before. Nothing changed. Not the method. Not the confidence. Not the feeling of seeing directly into a person's character. The statistical evidence of their failure had no effect on how they experienced the next evaluation. Kahneman later compared it to a visual illusion. You know the two lines are the same length. You can prove it, but you still see one as longer. He called it the illusion of validity. And he later wrote, "I had discovered my first cognitive illusion. Here is the mechanism. Confidence does not come from evidence. It comes from coherence. When the information available to you, however distorted, can be assembled into a clean story, the result feels certain." The soldiers produced a coherent scene. One man led. Another followed. The story wrote itself. And because the story was vivid and consistent, the evaluators felt sure. Not because the evidence was strong. Because it was clean. And there is a paradox inside this. It is easier to build a coherent story when you know less. Fewer pieces. Fewer contradictions. Less noise to explain away. Kahneman wrote, "You build the best possible story from the information available to you. And if it is a good story, you believe it." The acronym he used, "With you see is all there is," describes a system that never asks what it is missing. It works with what it has. And when what it has fits together, it calls the result knowledge. This is the confidence machine. It does not measure how much you know. It measures how well your story holds together. Before Nixon visited China in 1972, a young psychologist named Baruch Fiskoff asked people to predict the outcomes. Would Mao agree to meet with Nixon? Would the United States grant diplomatic recognition? Would a meaningful agreement emerge with the Soviet Union? People assigned probabilities to 15 possible outcomes. After Nixon returned, Fiskoff asked the same people to remember the probabilities they had assigned. For events that had occurred, people remembered assigning higher probabilities than they actually had. For events that had not occurred, they remembered being more skeptical. They did not lie. They simply could not retrieve their old beliefs. The new information, what actually happened, had overwritten the record. Their memory of their own uncertainty had been revised by the outcome. Fiskoff called it hindsight bias. The minute, a long effect, and its deepest consequence is not that people take credit they do not deserve. It is that the world appears more knowable than it is. If you always knew what was going to happen, then surely the future must be predictable, and anyone who failed to predict it must have been negligent or blind. Hindsight corrupts the evaluation of decisions. Consider the city of Duluth, Minnesota. Officials had to decide whether to hire a full-time bridge monitor to watch for debris that might block water flow. When people were shown only the evidence that existed at the time of the decision, 24% said the city should hire the monitor. When a different group was told that debris had in fact blocked the river and caused a major flood, 56% said the city should have hired the monitor, even though they were explicitly instructed not to let the outcome influence their judgment. The outcome rewrites the decision. A reasonable gamble that fails becomes reckless. A lucky bet that succeeds becomes visionary. This is outcome bias. And it means that the quality of a decision is almost never judged on its own terms. Consider a company. 2 graduate students. A search algorithm. A series of good decisions. A few years later, one of the most valuable enterprises on Earth. The story sounds inevitable, but there was a moment, early on, when the founders were willing to sell the entire company for less than $1 million. The buyer said no. The price was too high. Nassim Taleb called this the narrative fallacy, the way stories of the past become smooth, causal, and clean in retrospect. Good stories are simple. They assign large roles to talent and intention. They treat luck as a footnote. Mentioning one lucky break, the failed sale, actually makes the illusion worse. It makes it easier to underestimate the hundreds of other moments where luck could have ended the story entirely. Jim Collins' Built to Last compared 18 pairs of companies, successful versus less successful. The book became a management Bible, but the gap between the two groups shrank to almost nothing in the years after the study period ended. Fortune magazine's most admired companies did worse. Over 20 years, the worst-rated firms earned higher stock returns than the most admired. The correlation between CEO quality and firm performance is roughly 0.30. That means the stronger CEO leads the more successful firm only about 60% of the time, a 10 percentage point improvement over a coin flip. Barely enough to notice, not enough for hero worship. But the stories written about those CEOs do not sound like coin flips. The same executive is called flexible and decisive when things go well, and rigid and confused when they do not. Both descriptions feel right at the time. Both are produced by the halo effect, working backward from the outcome to explain the person. The world is noisier than the stories we tell about it, and the stories we tell about it are the ones the confidence machine prefers. In 1954, a psychologist named Paul Meehl published what he later called My Disturbing Little Book. He reviewed 20 studies. In each, trained professionals, counselors, clinicians, parole officers made predictions using interviews, personal impressions, and years of experience. Their predictions were then compared to a simple formula. A formula using only a few variables. No interviews, no impressions, no judgment. In 11 of 14 comparisons, the formula won, not a different expert, not a smarter clinician. A formula, an equation on a page. Since Meehl, roughly 200 studies have replicated the pattern. About 60% find the algorithm significantly more accurate. The rest are ties, and ties favor the algorithm because it costs almost nothing. No convincing exception has been documented. The economist Orley Ashenfelter wanted to predict the future prices of Bordeaux wines from information available the year the grapes were picked. He used 3 variables: average summer temperature, harvest rainfall, and total winter rainfall. His formula predicted prices with a correlation above 0.90. Wine experts who could taste the grapes, walk the vineyards, and draw on decades of professional knowledge did worse than the formula. The response from the wine world was not gratitude. One enophile called the findings ludicrous and absurd. Another said it was like judging movies without actually seeing them. They were not angry at the formula, they were angry at what the formula implied about them. There are 2 reasons algorithms beat experts. The first is that experts try to be clever. They think outside the box. They weigh complex combinations of factors. Complexity reduces validity. Simple combinations work better. The second reason is more damaging. Humans are inconsistent. Experienced radiologists who evaluate the same chest X-ray on 2 separate occasions contradict themselves 20% of the time. The same X-ray, the same radiologist. Different answer. Unreliable judgments cannot be valid predictors of anything. The noise inside the judge is louder than the signal in the evidence. In 1953, an anesthesiologist named Virginia Apgar was asked over breakfast how one might systematically assess a newborn infant. She jotted down 5 variables on a napkin: heart rate, respiration, reflex, muscle tone, color. Each scored 0 to 2. 1 minute after birth. Before the Apgar score, Physicians used their clinical judgment. Different practitioners focused on different cues. Some watched for breathing, others listened for crying. Without a standard, danger signs were missed. Infants died. The APGAR score is a formula. 5 variables, 3 levels, a 10-point scale. It is credited with saving hundreds of thousands of lives. It worked not because physicians were incompetent. It worked because a checklist is consistent and a human is not. In 1955, Kahneman, then a 21-year-old lieutenant, was ordered to redesign the Israeli army's interview system. He had read Meal's book. He believed it. He designed structured interviews with 6 traits: responsibility, sociability, masculine pride, and 3 others, each scored independently on a 5-point scale. Factual questions only. No global impressions. No intuitive leaps. The interviewers nearly mutinied. One complained, "You are turning us into robots." Kahneman compromised. He said, "Carry out the interview exactly as instructed. And when you are done, close your eyes. Try to imagine this person as a soldier, and give them one final score." The results came back months later. The formula, the sum of the 6 trait scores, worked. It was a substantial improvement over the old system. But the surprise was the other score. The close your eyes score. The intuitive judgment. It performed just as well as the formula. But only, and this is the point, after the disciplined collection of objective data. The intuition added value only when it followed structure. When it came first, when it was all there was, it was noise. 45 years later, after the Nobel Prize, Kahneman visited the base. The officer in charge described their current interview practices. They had not changed much. She came to the end of her description and added, "And then we tell them, close your eyes." Gary Klein studies experts who get things right. His firefighters sense when a floor is about to collapse. His nurses feel when an infant's condition is about to deteriorate. His chess masters see the winning move before they can explain why. Kahneman studies experts who get things wrong. His clinicians predict confidently and inaccurately. His stock pickers mistake dice rolls for skill. His evaluators see true character on an obstacle field and learn nothing from their failures. They should have been enemies. Instead, they spent 7 years writing a single paper. Its title tells you everything. Conditions for Intuitive Expertise. A failure to disagree. These are the 2 conditions for valid intuition. Both must be met. First, an environment that is sufficiently regular to be predictable. Second, an opportunity to learn these regularities through prolonged practice. Chess meets them. The board is regular. Patterns recur. A master has seen 10,000 configurations. The feedback is immediate. You win or you lose. Intuition, in chess, is recognition. Nothing more, nothing less. Fire spiting meets them. Fires behave according to physics. A commander who has fought hundreds of fires has learned to read the cues, the color of the smoke, the sound of the structure, the feel of the floor beneath his boots. His intuition is earned. Herbert Simon, the decision scientist, defined it plainly. Intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. But stock picking does not meet the conditions. The market is not predictable. The feedback is delayed and ambiguous. The environment is what researchers call zero validity. In 1984, Kahneman visited a Wall Street firm. He asked a senior investment manager a simple question. "When you sell a stock, who buys it?" The manager waved toward the window. "Someone else. Someone who looked at the same information and reached the opposite conclusion." One of them was wrong. Both were confident. Terry Otting studied 10,000 brokerage accounts, 163,000 trades. On average, the stocks investors sold outperformed the stocks they bought by 3.2 percentage points per year. Taking a shower and doing nothing would have been a better strategy. Odeon published a paper titled "Trading is Hazardous to Your Wealth." The most active traders had the poorest results. A follow-up, titled "Boys Will Be Boys," showed that men traded more frequently than women and earned less as a result. The confidence to act was the source of the damage. Kahneman was invited to speak at a wealth management firm. He was given the performance data of 25 advisors across 8 consecutive years. He computed 28 correlation coefficients, every pairing of years. The average correlation was 0.01. The results were indistinguishable from a dice rolling contest. If you had replaced the advisors with coin flips, the data would have looked the same. He told them. They heard him. They did not absorb it. The executive who drove him to the airport said, "I have done very well for the firm and no one can take that away from me." Kahneman thought, "Well, I took it away from you this morning." He later wrote, "Facts that challenge basic assumptions and thereby threaten people's livelihood and self-esteem are simply not absorbed. The mind does not digest them. The boundary is clean. On one side, regular environments, fast feedback, thousands of repetitions, chess, firefighting, nursing, anesthesiology. The APGAR score? On this side, intuition is recognition. It is earned. It is real. On the other side, irregular environments, slow or absent feedback, noise disguised as signal, stock picking, long-term political forecasting. The evaluation of business leaders. On this side, intuition is a feeling that has the shape of knowledge but none of its substance. Philip Tetlock studied 284 experts who made their living commenting on political and economic trends. He collected more than 80,000 predictions. They performed worse than dart-throwing monkeys distributing their choices evenly across 3 options. The experts with one big theory, the hedgehogs, did worst. The ones with complex, self-doubting frameworks, the foxes, did slightly better, but still poorly. And here is the finding that Kahneman and Klein agreed on, the sentence they both signed. The confidence that people have in their intuitions is not a reliable guide to their validity. Confidence tells you the story is coherent. It does not tell you the story is true. A physician in the early 20th century developed uncanny intuitions about which patients would develop typhoid. He tested his hunches by palpating their tongues, without washing his hands between patients. His predictions were accurate, not because he had genuine skill, because he was causing the disease. His confidence was absolute. His environment was wicked. Return to the prediction you made at the beginning of this episode. You rated your confidence. You produced a number. And that number came not from the base rate, which you may not have known, but from the story. A Stanford founder. 40% growth. Analysts who used the right words. The story was coherent, and coherence felt like knowledge. But notice what you did not do. You did not ask how many startups that looked exactly like this one failed anyway. You did not consult the denominator. You built a story forward, from the description to the outcome, and called it a prediction. That is not prediction, that is planning. You wrote a future from the inside, and it felt true because the narrative held together. Return to the hospital. She is confident. Her environment was not regular. Her feedback was not fast. She failed both conditions for valid intuition. But that is not the deepest problem. The deepest problem is this. She has already written the story of what happens next. 6 weeks of treatment, 2 weeks of stabilization, gradual improvement, discharge. She can see the patient walking out. She can see the family in the hallway. She has written the ending before the first chapter has begun. She did not include the complications. She did not include the delays. She did not include the possibility that the treatment fails entirely, even though, statistically, that is the most likely outcome. Because the plan is not a forecast. It is a story. And stories, the kind the confidence machine writes, have endings that feel inevitable before they happen. She trusted her estimate. But every estimate is a plan. And every plan is a story told from the inside, where the view is clean, the obstacles are small, and the ending is the one you want. Think of the last thing you planned. A project, a renovation, a deadline you set for yourself. How long did you say it would take? How long did it actually take? You were asked this at the end of the last episode. You had two numbers. The number you said, and the number it actually was. Hold the gap between them. In 2002, a survey asked American homeowners who had remodeled their kitchens how much they expected to pay before the work began. The average estimate was $18,658. The average final cost was $38,769. More than double. Not for luxury additions, not for scope changes they chose, for the same kitchen they planned to build, in the same house, with the same contractor standing in the same room. They did not miscalculate. They narrated. They told themselves a story in which the timeline held, the materials arrived on schedule, and nothing went wrong. The story was coherent. The story was plausible. The story was not a forecast. It was a best-case scenario that felt like a plan. She predicted the treatment would work. Her colleagues agreed. Someone drew the timeline. Someone else approved it with a nod. No one in the room asked a question that would have changed everything. No one asked, of patients like this one, in this ward, with this diagnosis, under any team, how many were discharged on that schedule. The reference class was never consulted. The plan was the only story in the room. A committee of psychologists and teachers had been meeting every Friday afternoon for about a year. Their project was ambitious, a high school curriculum on judgment and decision-making. They had constructed a detailed outline. They had written a couple of chapters. They had run sample lessons in classrooms. The work felt real. The progress felt measurable. One Friday, Kahneman had an idea. He asked each member of the group to write down, privately, their estimate of how long it would take to finish the textbook and submit it to the Ministry of Education. He collected the slips. He wrote the numbers on the blackboard. The estimates clustered around 2 years. The range was narrow, 1.5 to 2.5. The group had converged without speaking. Each person, working alone, had arrived at roughly the same future. Then, Kahneman turned to Seymour Fox. Seymour Fox was the dean of the Hebrew University's School of Education. He was an expert in curriculum development. He had watched projects like this one begin, proceed, and sometimes end. Kahneman asked him a different question. Not about their team, about other teams. Could he think of other groups, similar to theirs, that had attempted to develop a curriculum from scratch? He could. Several. The question continued. Of those teams, when they had made as much progress as this group had made, an outline, a couple of chapters, sample lessons, how many eventually finished? He fell silent. When he finally spoke, it seemed to Kahneman that he was blushing. 40% of comparable teams never finished at all. The room changed. Kahneman pressed further. Of those who did finish, how long did it take? 7 to 10 years. For the teams that succeeded, 40% failure for those that did not. And minutes earlier, every person at the table, including Seymour himself, had written down 2 years. Kahneman asked one more question. Compared to those other teams, how good was this group? How would Seymour rank them? Below average. But not by much. They heard it. They understood it. A 40% chance of total failure. A minimum of 7 years for those who survived. Their own experts' assessment that they were below average. And then they did nothing. No one proposed a revised timeline. No one suggested reconsidering the scope. No one asked whether the project should continue. After a few minutes of what Kahneman later called desultory debate, the group gathered itself together and carried on as if nothing had happened. The book took 8 years. By the time it was delivered, Kahneman had left Israel. He was no longer part of the team. The Ministry of Education, whose enthusiasm had started the project, had lost interest during the intervening years. The textbook was never used. Kahneman later identified 3 lessons from that Friday afternoon. The first was the distinction between the inside view and the outside view. The second was the planning fallacy itself, the tendency for plans to resemble best-case scenarios rather than realistic assessments. The third lesson took longer to accept: irrational perseverance. The group had not merely failed to predict, it had failed to quit. They had invested a year of Friday afternoons, and that investment, that sunk cost, made the outside view feel like a reason to feel bad rather than a reason to stop. There was no way to foresee the sequence of events that would drag the project across 8 years. The divorces, the illnesses, the bureaucratic crises. These are the unknown unknowns, and there are always more ways for a plan to fail than any planner can imagine. The inside view does not account for them, because the inside view cannot see what has not yet gone wrong. 2 forecasts had been made in that room. The first came from the inside, from the team's knowledge of its own plan, its own progress, its own capabilities. The outline was detailed. The chapters were written. The pace felt sustainable. From the inside, 2 years was not optimistic. It was arithmetic. The second came from the outside, from the statistics of teams that had faced the same task. From the outside, 2 years was not arithmetic. It was fiction. Kahneman and Tversky named these the inside view. The inside view builds a forecast from the specifics of the case. The outside view builds a forecast from the statistics of the class, and the inside view almost always wins, not because it is more accurate, but because it is more vivid, more personal, and more coherent. In 1997, the proposed Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh was estimated to cost up to £40 million. By 1999, the budget had risen to £109 million. In 2000, legislators imposed a cap, £195 million, a ceiling that could not be breached. By 2001, the estimated final cost was $241 million. Cap lasted 11 months. It rose twice more in 2002, 3 more times in 2003. The building was completed in 2004 at an ultimate cost of roughly £431 million, more than 10 times the original estimate. Not for a different building, for the same one. A 2005 study examined rail projects undertaken worldwide between 1969 and 1998. In more than 90% of cases, passenger numbers had been overestimated. The average passenger overestimate was 106%. Planners predicted more than twice the riders who actually came. The average cost overrun was 45%. And over 30 years of accumulated data, the forecasts did not improve. As more evidence became available, the experts did not become more reliant on it. The inside view does not learn. It tells the same story every time. The story of this project, this plan, this team, and it tells it from the only perspective available, the one where everything goes roughly as expected. The 5-year survival rate for small businesses in the United States is approximately 35%. 2 out of 3 will not exist in 5 years. When surveyed, American entrepreneurs estimated the chances of success for any business like theirs at 60%. Nearly double the actual rate. But the distortion deepened when they assessed their own odds. 81% put their personal probability of success at 7 out of 10 or higher. 33% said their chance of failing was 0. You must wonder, would the restaurant owner still have invested her savings if she had checked the odds? If she had learned that 60% of new restaurants close within 3 years? The idea of consulting the outside view probably never occurred to her. She knew her recipe. She knew herself. From the inside, the plan was sound. The denominator did not exist. Kahneman and his wife, on vacation, found a motel on a little-traveled road in the middle of a forest on Vancouver Island. The owners were a charming young couple, former schoolteachers from Alberta who had used their life savings to buy the property. They had bought it cheap, because 6 or 7 previous owners had failed to make a go of it. They were planning to take out a loan to build a restaurant beside it. They told Kahneman and his wife about it without irony and without self-consciousness. They felt no need to explain why they expected to succeed where 6 or 7 others had failed. This is not stupidity. This is the inside view operating at full power. The couple knew their own strengths, their own energy. They could see the restaurant. They could see the guests. What they could not see, because the inside view does not show it, was the reference class. 7 failures on the same motel. The same forest. The same market that could not sustain the business, no matter who ran it. Economists have a name for people like them: optimistic martyrs. Good for the economy, because they signal new markets to more qualified competitors. Bad for themselves and their investors, because confidence is not a substitute for demand. The chairman of Disney Studios was asked why so many expensive big-budget movies are released on the same weekend: Memorial Day, Independence Day, guaranteeing that they will cannibalize each other's audiences. His answer was one word, repeated: hubris. Hubris. He continued, if you only think about your own business, you think, I've got a good marketing department. We're going to go out and do this. And you don't think that everybody else is thinking the same way. Colin Camera and Dan Lavallo called this competition neglect. Your own team. Your own team. Your own product. The question you answer is, do we have a good film? The question you need to answer is, given that 5 other studios are thinking exactly what we are thinking, how many people will see our film? But the second question requires you to model the inside view of your competitors, and the inside view, by definition, does not look outward. For a number of years, professors at Duke University surveyed the chief financial officers of large corporations. Each CFO was asked to estimate the returns of the S&P 500 over the following year. Over 11,600 forecasts were collected. The correlation between their estimates and actual returns was slightly less than 0. When they predicted the market would go down, it was slightly more likely to go up. They had no clue. But the truly damaging finding was not the inaccuracy, it was the confidence. Each CFO was also asked to set an 80% confidence interval, a range they were 90% sure the actual return would not exceed on the high end, and 90% sure it would not fall below on the low end. Only 20% of outcomes should fall outside that range. 67% did. More than 3 times the expected rate. The researchers calculated what the confidence intervals would need to have been to achieve the proper surprise rate. The answer: intervals more than 4 times wider than what the CFOs stated. A truthful interval might have read, there is an 80% chance returns will be between -10 and +30%. But a CFO who said that to colleagues would be laughed out of the room. The wide interval is a confession of ignorance. And ignorance, in a profession paid for certainty, is socially impermissible. Kahneman once asked his cousin, a distinguished lawyer, a simple question about a reference class. What is the probability of the defendant winning in cases like this one? His answer was sharp. Every case is unique. And his expression made clear that the question itself was inappropriate, superficial, beneath the work. This is the moral resistance to the outside view. The inside view carries weight, not just because it is vivid, but because it feels respectful. To consult the base rate is to treat this patient as a statistic, this case as a category, this plan as one of many. It feels impersonal. It feels like surrendering the specifics that make the case worth fighting. Medicine shows the same ambivalence. A study of patients who died in the ICU compared the diagnoses made by their clinicians while they were still alive to the autopsy results. Physicians who reported being completely certain of the diagnoses were wrong 40% of the time. Confidence is valued over uncertainty. There is a prevailing censure against disclosing doubt to patients. An expert who admits the full extent of what they do not know can expect to be replaced by a more confident competitor. The pattern is consistent across professions. Risk-takers do not have an unusual appetite for gambles on high stakes. They are merely less aware of the risks than more cautious people are. Kahneman and Dan Lavallo called it bold forecasts and timid decisions, the tendency to overestimate the upside while failing to examine the downside. The inside view persists not because it is accurate, but because it is expected. Because planning is social. Because the person who says, "I don't know the odds," is not rewarded for honesty. They are punished for weakness. Gary Klein is a psychologist who has spent his career defending expert intuition. He studies firefighters who sense a collapsing floor, nurses who detect a failing infant, commanders who act before they can explain why. He is not, by temperament, a man who distrusts the gut. But Klein proposed a technique that turns the gut against itself. Imagine that we are a year into the future. We implemented the plan as it now exists. The outcome was a disaster. Please take 5 to 10 minutes to write a brief history of that disaster. He called it the pre-mortem. The logic is precise. When a team converges on a decision, and especially when a leader has tipped their hand, public doubt becomes evidence of disloyalty. The person who says, "I'm not sure this will work," is not heard as cautious. They are heard as unsupportive. Gruding does not suppress information. It suppresses the willingness to share it. The pre-mortem reverses the social pressure. It asks everyone to imagine failure. It makes doubt not just permissible, but required. And it unleashes the imagination, the same imagination that built the optimistic plan, in the direction of everything that could go wrong. When Kahneman described the pre-mortem at a session in Davos, someone behind him muttered, "It was worth coming to Davos just for this." It turned out to be the CEO of a major international corporation. The Danish planning expert Bent Flyvbjerg built a discipline around the outside view. He called it reference class forecasting. The procedure is mechanical. It is 3 steps. And it works. Identify the reference class, kitchen renovations, rail projects, curriculum development teams. Obtain the statistics of that class, completion rates, cost overruns, timelines. Then, and only then, adjust for the specifics of your case. Not before. Not instead. After. Flyvbjerg applied this method to transportation projects across several countries, using a database of hundreds of plans and their outcomes. The database did not tell planners what to do. It told them where the ballpark was. And almost without exception, the inside view was not even in the ballpark. But there is a caveat. One official told Flyvbjerg, "A budget reserve is to contractors, as red meat is to lions, and they will devour it." The outside view can be gamed. It can be weaponized. It can become just another number in a room full of numbers. The tool works. But it works only if it is consulted before the plan becomes identity. The pre-mortem and the reference class are tools. They function. They are available. They are almost never used. And the reason is not ignorance. Kahneman's team knew the outside view. They heard it from Seymour's own mouth. 7 years minimum. 40% failure. Below average. They understood it. They accepted it as a fact about other teams, in other buildings, working on other projects. And they carried on as if it were about someone else. Kahneman later reflected, "I had played the roles of chief dunce and inept leader. The project was his initiative. It was his responsibility to force the discussion. But no one pressed him, and there was no crisis, only some new facts about people they did not know." The outside view, he discovered, is much easier to ignore than bad news in your own effort. This is the deepest problem. The outside view must arrive before the inside view has become the plan. Before the plan has become the budget. Before the budget has become the commitment. Before the commitment has become proof of who you are. Because once the plan is identity, once canceling the project means admitting you were wrong, wasting a year, embarrassing yourself in front of the team you assembled, the statistics of comparable cases are not evidence. They are insults. And the mind has no trouble dismissing an insult. Return to the kitchen. The couple paid $38,000 for an $18,000 plan. They are not angry. They like the kitchen. The overrun has already been absorbed into the story. The marble was worth it. The contractor found a problem behind the wall. These things happen. But these things do not happen. These things are the base rate. The overrun is not the exception. It is the median outcome for every kitchen renovation in the dataset. The surprise is not that this kitchen costs double. The surprise would have been if it had not. Return to the hospital. The plan is on the board. The timeline ascends. The milestones are clean. And no one asked about the reference class, the other teams, the other timelines that ended differently. She trusted the plan, not because the evidence supported it, because the story was coherent, because the colleagues agreed, because drawing a line that goes up and to the right feels like knowing what happens next. But the plan moves forward. The treatment begins. The timeline is the only map in the room. And the question that was never asked, the question about the reference class, about the base rate, about the outside view, that question will return, not as a statistic, as something that feels far more personal. Every plan is a story told from the inside. She told one. Her colleagues believed it. The outside view was available. It was not consulted. But the question was never about the plan. The question was about the loss. That was the last thing you heard. The question was about the loss. Hold that sentence. It is the key to everything that follows. Here is a bet. A coin will be tossed. If it lands on tails, you lose $100. If it lands on heads, you win $150. The expected value is positive. You stand to gain more than you stand to lose. A perfectly rational agent would take this bet every time. Would you take it? Most people say no. Not because the math is wrong. Because the feeling is. The prospect of losing $100 produces a sensation that $150 of winning cannot overcome. The pain of losing is not the opposite of the pleasure of gaining. It is larger. It is older. She was asked, "Would you bet your career on this?" She said yes. She would not have said yes to a different version of the same question. Would you risk a patient's life? Same data, same odds, different frame, different answer. Loss aversion. The question she answered was not the question she was asked. It started with a book, a slim volume with a dark red cover. An essay by the economist Bruno Frey. Amos Tversky slid it across the desk to Daniel Kahneman and waited. The opening line described the agent of economic theory. Rational, selfish, and his tastes do not change. Kahneman read it. Ah! And something caught. Not the rationality. They had already spent years dismantling that. Not the selfishness. The stability. The assumption that the value of something depends on how much of it you have. That a person with $5 million has a fixed amount of happiness, regardless of whether they had 1 million yesterday or 9. That assumption had a name. It had been the foundation of economic theory for 250 years. And it was wrong. Jack and Jill both have $5 million today. By every measure in classical economics, they should be equally happy. Utility is a function of wealth. Same wealth, same utility. But yesterday, Jack had 1 million. He has just received $4 million. He is elated. Yesterday, Jill had 9 million. She has just lost $4 million. She is devastated. Same wealth, different happiness. The theory says this should not happen. Utility depends on the final state. The path you took to get there is irrelevant. But Kahneman knew instantly, as anyone would, that the path is the only thing that matters. Jack is rich. Jill is ruined. The number 5 million means nothing without knowing where they started. In 1738, Daniel Bernoulli proposed that the utility of wealth is not linear. $1,000 means more to a beggar than to a billionaire. The relationship is logarithmic. Each additional unit of wealth produces less additional happiness. This was elegant. This was useful. This was the foundation upon which all of expected utility theory was built. And it contained a flaw that survived 250 years. Bernoulli defined utility as a function of the final state of wealth, not the change, not the movement, the destination. Jack and Jill, in Bernoulli's framework, are the same person. Kahneman later called this theory-induced blindness. The theory was so useful, so deeply embedded in the mathematics of economics, that the flaw became invisible, not because it was hidden, because no one had reason to look. Anthony has $1 million. Betty has $4 million. Both are offered the same gamble, a 50-50 chance to end up with either $1 million or $4 million. Or they can skip the gamble and take $2 million, guaranteed. Anthony looks at the gamble. He could gain $3 million or gain nothing. But the sure thing gives him $1 million, a guaranteed gain. He takes the sure thing. He is risk-averse. Betty looks at the same gamble. She could lose $3 million more, down to 1, or stay where she is. The sure thing gives her $2 million, a guaranteed loss of $2 million from where she stands. She takes the gamble. She is risk-seeking. Same gamble, same final states, same probabilities. Opposite decisions. Bernoulli's theory cannot explain this. Expected utility says they should choose the same thing because the outcomes are the same. But Anthony is playing from a position of gain, and Betty is playing from a position of loss. Their reference points are different, and the reference point determines everything. They walked. For 5 years, they walked. Through the quiet streets of Jerusalem, through afternoons that stretched into evenings, they built a theory by conversation. Not in a lab, not at a blackboard, in motion, side by side, finishing each other's objections before they were raised. The theory they built would become the most cited paper in the history of the social sciences. It was published in Econometrica in 1979. They called it prospect theory, and it began with 3 observations about how the mind actually experiences value. 1. Evaluation is relative to a reference point. 2. Sensitivity diminishes as magnitude increases. 3. Losses loom larger than gains. This is the shape of how you feel. The right side is gains. The curve rises, but it flattens. The difference between $100 and $200 feels larger than the difference between $900 and $1,000. This is diminishing sensitivity. The same principle Bernoulli noticed, applied not to total wealth but to changes from where you stand. The left side is losses. The curve drops, and it drops faster, steeper. The pain of losing $100 is not equal to the pleasure of gaining $100. It is roughly twice as strong. The loss aversion ratio, measured across dozens of studies, falls between 1.5 to 1 on average. You need to gain about $200 to compensate for the pain of losing $100. This is not a preference. It is not a decision. It is a feature of the nervous system, built into the architecture of evaluation. The amygdala responds to a threatening face in less than 0.02 of a second before the conscious mind has registered what it is looking at. Bad events are processed faster, remembered longer, and weighted more heavily than good ones. A single cockroach will ruin a bowl of cherries. A single cherry will do nothing for a bowl of cockroaches. The psychologist John Gottman studied marriages. He found that for a relationship to survive, the ratio of good interactions to bad must be at least 5-1. Not because people are ungrateful, because each negative interaction carries the emotional weight of 5 positive ones. The architecture of loss aversion is the architecture of love. Professional golfers putt more accurately when they are putting for par, avoiding a bogey, which is a loss, than when they are putting for birdie, which is a gain. The difference is measurable. For Tiger Woods alone, it was worth approximately $1 million per season. He was not more skilled on par putts. He was more motivated. The loss was watching. After a blizzard, 82% of people surveyed said it was unfair for a hardware store to raise the price of snow shovels. The store had something people needed. The price was the reference point. Changing it felt like a loss, even though no one was forced to buy. This is loss aversion applied to the market itself. The status quo is the reference point, and any departure from it in the wrong direction registers as harm. The experiment was run dozens of times. Half the students received a coffee mug. The other half received nothing. Then they were asked to trade. The sellers, the students who had the mug, were asked the minimum price at which they would sell. The buyers were asked the maximum price they would pay. Sellers wanted $7.12. The buyers would pay $2.87. A gap of more than 2-1. For a mug they had owned for less than 10 minutes. There was a third group. Choosers. They were shown the mug and asked, "Would you prefer to have this mug or this amount of cash?" No ownership, no loss, just a choice. Their valuation was $3.12, nearly identical to the buyers. The sellers and the choosers faced the same decision, mug or money. But the sellers owned the mug. Giving it up was a loss, and the loss doubled the price. This is the endowment effect. Owning something changes its value, not in the market, but in the mind. The mug on your desk is worth more than the identical mug in the store, because the mug on your desk can be taken from you, and the prospect of losing activates a system that the prospect of gaining does not. A professor of economics, a man who taught rational choice theory, would not sell a bottle of wine from his collection for $100, even though he would never pay more than $35 for the same bottle at auction. He was not irrational. He was human. The wine was his. The pain of giving it up exceeded the pleasure of the money that would replace it. Loss aversion is not a theory about irrational people. It is a theory about people. Richard Thaler, the economist who first named the endowment effect, had been collecting examples of irrationality for years. He called them anomalies. He had no theory to explain them. Then he read a draft of prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky's paper, before it was published, and the anomalies organized themselves. Loss aversion explained the endowment effect. The endowment effect explained the wine. The wine explained the professor. The professor was everyone. But there is a caveat. Experienced traders show no endowment effect. In experiments, 48% of experienced traders traded their mugs away, compared to 18% of novices. Goods held for exchange, inventory, stock, currency, do not trigger loss aversion the way goods held for use do. The mug on your desk is different from the mug in the warehouse. The difference is not the mug. The difference is whether your mind has classified it as yours. Prospect theory predicts a pattern, not a single bias. A fourfold pattern that governs how you respond to risk depending on 2 variables. Whether you face a gain or a loss, and whether the probability is high or low. When the probability of a gain is high, you become cautious. You have something almost certain, and you do not want to lose it. You accept less than the expected value to lock in the win. This is the certainty effect. The jump from 95% to 100% feels enormous, far larger than the jump from 50 to 55. When the probability of a gain is low, you become reckless. The tiny chance of a large win captures the imagination. You overweight it? You buy the lottery ticket. You reject a sure $500 for a 5% chance at 10,000. The possibility effect, the jump from 0 to 5%, feels like the jump from impossible to real. When the probability of a loss is high, you gamble. The loss is almost certain, and you cannot accept it. You take desperate risks to avoid it, even when the gamble makes the expected outcome worse. This is why defendants reject plea bargains. This is why failing companies double down. This is why losing generals attack. When the probability of a loss is low, you become cautious again, but in the wrong direction. You overweigh the small chance of disaster. You buy insurance you do not need. You pay 3 times more to eliminate a risk entirely than to reduce it by 2/3, even when the reduction saves more expected value. Parents in one study were willing to pay far more to reduce the risk of a pesticide from 5 in 10 million to 0 than to reduce it from 15 in 10 million to 5. The objective improvement was identical. The psychological improvement was not. 0 is not a number. 0 is a feeling. For cells, for patterns. Each one a departure from rational, expected value. Each one produced by the same machinery, the reference point, diminishing sensitivity, and loss aversion, interacting with the way the mind transforms probabilities into decision weights. Decision weights are not probabilities. They are what probabilities feel like. And what they feel like is systematically distorted. They published the paper in Econometrica in 1979, Prospect Theory. It would become the most cited paper in the social sciences, not because it was the most complex, because it asked the simplest question no one had thought to ask. Not, how much do you have? But, compared to what? Bernoulli's theory had endured for 250 years because it was useful. It generated predictions. It built models. It trained generations of economists. And it contained a flaw, visible to anyone who paused to think about Jack and Jill. The flaw survived not because it was hidden, but because the theory was so productive that no one had incentive to look. Kahneman called this theory-induced blindness. The theory becomes the lens, and the lens cannot see itself. What Kahneman and Tversky built in those 5 years on those quiet streets was not a correction to expected utility theory. It was a replacement of its deepest assumption. The mind does not evaluate final states. It evaluates changes, not where you are, but where you are relative to where you expected to be. The reference point is not in the world. It is in the mind, and it can be moved. Return to the coin. The bet was good. The expected value was positive. You knew this. Then most of you said no. Not because you miscalculated. Because the loss of $100 was more vivid, more urgent, more real than the gain of 150. System 2 can do the math. But the critical input, the feeling that drives the decision, comes from System 1. And System 1 does not do math. It does pain. The mathematician Matthew Rabin proved something remarkable. If a person rejects this small, favorable gamble consistently across modest stakes, then their implied risk aversion at larger stakes becomes absurd. They would reject a 50-50 chance to lose $200 or gain $20,000. They would reject a 50-50 chance to lose $300 or gain the entire wealth of the world. The rejection of the small bet, taken seriously, implies a level of risk aversion that no rational agent would hold. The preference is not rational. It is visceral. It is loss aversion, operating at the scale of a $100 bill. Return to the hospital. 70% success and 90% survival are not the same frame. One emphasizes what is gained. The other whispers what is lost. She heard the version about betting her career, a gain frame, and she said yes. She did not hear the version about risking a life, a loss frame, because no one asked it that way. The reference point was chosen for her. The question was asked in a frame, and the frame determined the answer before she began to think. The loss was always larger than the gain. She felt it before she understood it. The reference point was never neutral. It was chosen. And if the reference point can be chosen, if the starting position can be moved, then the frame is not a window. It is a weapon. The frame changed. And the frame is the most powerful tool the machine has. A disease is expected to kill 600 people unless you act. You have 2 programs to choose from. Program A will save 200 people. Program B has a 1/3 probability that all 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Which do you choose? Hold your answer. Do not revise it. Do not hedge. You chose one. You felt something shift, a preference, a leaning, a sense that one option was obviously better. That feeling is real. It came from somewhere. And in a moment, you will discover exactly where. Now, the same disease. The same 600 people. The same 2 programs, written in a different language. Program C means 400 people will die. Program D has a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that all 600 people will die. Which do you choose? Answer again. Now compare your 2 answers. Program A and Program C are identical. 200 saved out of 600 means 400 die. Program B and Program D are identical. The same gamble, the same odds, the same body count. The only thing that changed was the frame, and your preference reversed. When the frame said saved, you chose certainty. When the frame said die, you chose the gamble. You did not change your values. You did not receive new information. The frame changed, and the frame changed you. She counted the last 3. She had saved the last 3. The number felt like a surplus, a balance in an account she did not know she was keeping. I have saved the last 3. I can afford one risk. A narrow frame. Italy won. France lost. These are the same fact, the same event, the same score, but they are not the same sentence. Italy won is a story about triumph. France lost is a story about failure. The information is identical. The feeling is not. This is not a trick. It is a structural feature of language, of thought, of every decision you have ever made. Every outcome can be described as a gain or a loss. Every statistic can be presented as survival or mortality. Every policy can be framed as what you keep or what is taken away. And the frame is never neutral, because you are never neutral. Your brain treats gains and losses as different substances, and it responds to them with different machinery. A patient is considering surgery. The surgeon describes the odds. The first version, the 90-day survival rate is 90%. The second version, there is a 10% mortality rate in the first 90 days. 90% survive and 10% die are the same number. The same surgery. The same anesthesia. The same room. But when patients heard 90% survive, 84% chose surgery. When they heard 10% die, only 50% did. You might assume this is a problem of unsophisticated patients, people who lack training, who do not understand statistics, who are overwhelmed by fear. The same study was run on physicians, experienced physicians. The results were the same. Doctors who heard 90% survival recommended surgery. Doctors who heard 10% mortality hesitated. The frame did not merely affect the patient's choice. It affected the expert's recommendation. The frame is not a veil over the decision. The frame is the decision. Germany's organ donation rate is 12%. Austria's is nearly 100%. The countries share a border. They share a culture. They do not share a form. In Germany, the form asks you to check a box if you want to donate. Most people do not check it. In Austria, The form asks you to check a box if you do not want to donate. Most people do not check it. The preference did not change. The default changed. The same inertia, the same path of least resistance, the same human reluctance to pick up a pen and make an active choice. That identical impulse produces 12% in one country and nearly 100% in the next. This is not manipulation. No one is being lied to. No information is being withheld. The question is the same, but the architecture of the question, which option requires action and which requires inaction, determines the answer for an entire nation. The frame is not decoration. The frame is architecture. And whoever designs the form designs the outcome. Return to the disease. 600 people. 2 programs. The same question, asked twice. Kahneman and Tversky gave this problem to 2 groups. When the frame said saved, 72% chose program A, this earn option. When the frame said die, 78% chose program D, the gamble. The same population. The same disease. The same arithmetic. Opposite choices. Not because the options changed, because the words changed. This is the mechanism you felt at the start of this episode. You were not deciding between programs. You were responding to a frame. The word saved activated the gain region of prospect theory, the concave curve, the certainty preference. The word die activated the loss region, the convex curve, the risk-seeking impulse. The frame did not inform your decision. The frame constructed it. Kahneman and Tversky's conclusion was stark. Framing should not be viewed as an intervention that masks or distorts an underlying preference. In the situations they studied, there was no underlying preference to be masked. The preference was created by the frame. There is no view from nowhere. There is no frameless window. Every choice arrives inside a sentence, and the sentence is the architecture. Richard Thaler posed a question. You have tickets to a basketball game tonight. It is an hour's drive. A blizzard has started. Do you go? No. The variation. The tickets were free. A friend gave them to you. Same game, same blizzard, same drive. Do you go? Most people who paid for the tickets will brave the storm. Most people who received them for free will stay home. The game is the same. The blizzard is the same. The risk is the same. The experience of sitting in the arena will be identical, regardless of how the ticket was acquired. But the ticket buyer has an open account. Money was spent. If the game is not attended, the account closes at a loss. The free ticket holder has no such account. There is nothing to lose by staying warm. This is mental accounting. The mind does not maintain a single balance sheet. It maintains dozens, separate accounts for entertainment, for food, for savings, for windfalls. Money in one account is not fungible with money in another. $100 bonus and $100 paycheck feel different, even though they spend the same. And the accounts do not merely track spending. They track pain. Closing an account at a loss is felt as a failure. The drive through the blizzard is not about the basketball game. It is about not wasting the money. The sunk cost, irrecoverable, irrelevant to the future, controls the decision because the mental account demands to be settled. A company has invested $50 million in a project. The project is behind schedule. To complete it will cost $60 million more. Meanwhile, a competing division has proposed an alternative project. Better technology, lower cost, higher expected return. But it would mean abandoning the first project entirely. The rational calculation is simple. The $50 million is gone. It cannot be recovered regardless of what happens next. The question is only, which project, starting now, with the money that remains, will produce the better outcome? The answer is the new project. The evidence is clear. But the executive reaches for the thick folder. Sunk cost fallacy is not a failure of arithmetic. It is a failure of accounting. The $50 million sits in a mental ledger, and that ledger demands resolution. To abandon the project is to close the account at a loss, to write the words "total loss" beside a number with 8 digits. The mind recoils. Not because the decision is wrong, but because the feeling of waste is unbearable. Good money follows bad. Not because the executive is foolish, but because the account is open, and open accounts ache. Mr. Brown almost never picks up hitchhikers. Today, he does. He is robbed. Mr. Smith picks up hitchhikers frequently. Today he does. He is robbed. Who feels greater regret? 88% of respondents, said Mr. Brown. The man who deviated from his routine. The man who made the exception. Not because his loss was greater. The robbery was identical, but because the alternative was more available. Mr. Brown can see the world in which he drove past. Mr. Smith cannot, because picking up hitchhikers is what he does. Regret is not proportional to loss. Regret is proportional to the gap between what happened and what almost happened. And that gap is widest when the action was unusual, when the person deviated from the default, from the routine, from the version of themselves they normally are. This is why action produces more regret than inaction. Paul owns stock in Company A. He considers switching to Company B but does not. He would have made $1,200. George owns stock in Company B. He switches to Company A. He loses $1,200. The financial outcome is the same. Both men end up with stock in Company A. Both have missed a $1,200 gain. But 92% of respondents say George feels more regret. Because George acted, because action creates a counterfactual that glows. The world in which you did nothing, the world in which you stayed. Inaction has no such ghost. It is the default, okay? And the default does not haunt you. This asymmetry is not irrational. It is architectural. The mind punishes deviation more than repetition, movement more than stillness, commission more than omission. And this punishment shapes decisions before they are made, not by forbidding risk, but by loading the cost of action with a regret surcharge that inaction does not carry. An investor holds 2 stocks. One has gained 30% since purchase. The other has lost 30%. She needs cash. She sells one. She sells the winner. This is the disposition effect, documented by Terence Odion across tens of thousands of individual trading accounts. Investors are 50% more likely to sell a stock that has gained value than one that has lost. The pattern is robust. It is consistent. It is exactly backwards. Tax law alone should reverse the behavior. Selling losers generates a tax deduction. But the mental accounts override the tax code. Selling the winner closes an account at a gain. Selling the loser closes an account at a loss. And closing at a loss is not merely financially disadvantageous. It is emotionally final. It converts a paper loss, a wound that might heal, into a realized loss. A fact, an entry in the permanent ledger. The investor is not making a financial decision. She is managing feelings, and the feelings have a ledger of their own. Thomas Schelling posed a question that has no comfortable answer. Should the child tax exemption be larger for the rich than for the poor? The answer feels obvious. No. That would be regressive, unfair. The poor need the benefit more. Now, reframe. Should a childless poor family pay the same tax surcharge as a childless rich family? Again, the answer feels obvious. No. The poor family cannot afford the same penalty. But you cannot hold both positions. A tax exemption for having children is mathematically identical to a surcharge for not having them. If the exemption is smaller for the rich, the surcharge is smaller for the rich. If the surcharge is larger for the poor, the exemption is larger for the poor. You cannot make the exemption favor the poor and the surcharge favor the poor. They are the same policy described in opposite frames. Schelling's paradox is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a demonstration that the frame is not removable. There is no neutral description of the tax code. There is no wording that is not a frame. You must choose one, exemption or surcharge, and the one you choose will determine what feels fair. The frame does not distort reality. The frame is reality. Or at least, the only reality your preferences can access. Sarah Lichtenstein and Paul Slavic placed two bets in front of their subjects. Bet A, a small chance at a large payoff. Bet B, a near certain small payoff. When asked which bet they would prefer to play, most people chose bet B, the near certainty, the safe option. Then they were asked a different question. How much would you sell each bet for? What is the lowest price you would accept? They priced bet A higher. The same person, the same session. Choose B, price A higher. This is a preference reversal, a direct violation of the assumption that you know what you want and that your knowledge is consistent. When economists David Crowther and Charles Plot heard about this finding, they set out to demolish it. They were certain the psychologists had made a methodological error. They designed an experiment specifically to eliminate every possible artifact, every procedural trick, every demand characteristic, every incentive-compatible confound. They confirmed the finding in every condition. The reversal occurs because choosing and pricing are different frames. When you choose, you compare the bets side by side, and the near certainty of bet B dominates your attention. When you price, you translate each bet into dollars, and the large payoff of bet A dominates the conversion. The frame of the question determines which feature is salient, and the salient feature determines the answer. You do not have a preference that is then expressed through choosing or pricing. The act of choosing creates one preference. The act of pricing creates another. They are not the same preference, viewed from two angles. They are two different preferences, manufactured by two different frames. A team at University College London put the Asian disease problem inside a brain scanner. When subjects chose, in accordance with the frame, certainty in the gain frame, the gamble in the loss frame, the emotional brain, the fast responder, the system that reads the frame before the conscious mind has parsed the numbers. When subjects resisted the frame, choosing the gamble in the gain frame, or certainty in the loss frame, the anterior cingulate cortex was active, the conflict detector, the system that recognizes the frame as a frame and flags it as a trap. And in the small number of subjects who were consistently frame-independent, who gave the same answer regardless of wording, a third region dominated. The prefrontal cortex, the executive, the override. 3 systems, 3 responses to the same words. The amygdala obeys the frame. The anterior cingulate detects the frame. The prefrontal cortex overrides the frame. And in most people, most of the time, the amygdala wins. Not because it is stronger, but because it is faster. It has processed the word saved or the word die before the prefrontal cortex has finished reading the sentence. The frame does not deceive you. The frame arrives before you. Paul Samuelson, the Nobel laureate, once offered a colleague a bet. A fair coin would be tossed. Heads, you win $200. Tails, you lose $100. A positive expected value. A rational bet? The colleague refused, but then added, I would take it if you offered me 100 of those bets. Samuelson found this irrational. If you would not accept 100, because each bet is a separate gamble. But the colleague's intuition was correct in a different way. One bet is a narrow frame, a single event that could go badly. 100 bets is a broad frame, a distribution, a curve that bends toward the expected value with each repetition. The narrow frame feels like a coin flip. The broad frame feels like an investment. They are the same arithmetic. They are different architecture. Toller told a story about a CEO who addressed his 25 division heads. He offered each of them the same risky bet, a project with a 50-50 chance of a large gain or a moderate loss. Not one division head would accept it individually. But the CEO wanted all 25 to accept because the CEO saw the broad frame, 25 independent bets that collectively would almost certainly produce a gain, while each division head saw only the narrow frame. One bet, one loss, one career consequence. Broad framing is a tool. Check your portfolio once a quarter, not once a day. Set risk policies. Always take the highest deductible. Never buy the extended warranty, so that each individual decision does not need to be felt as a separate loss. Think like a trader, not a gambler. But the tool requires effort. The narrow frame is the default, and the default, as we have seen, almost always wins. Return to the disease. 600 people. 2 programs. You answered twice. Your answers contradicted each other, and both answers felt right when you gave them. This is not a failure of your intelligence. This is the architecture of your mind. The frame arrives before deliberation. The words construct the feeling. The feeling constructs the choice, and by the time you have chosen, the frame has vanished, invisible, like the window you look through and never see. Kahneman wrote that framing should not be viewed as an intervention that masks or distorts an underlying preference. There is no underlying preference. The frame is not a lens over reality. The frame is the only reality available, and you cannot step outside it. You cannot choose without a frame. You can only choose which frame you stand inside, and even that choice has a frame. Return to the hospital. She counted the last 3. She counted them as saved. She did not count the ones she lost, not because she forgot them, but because the mental account only tracks the current streak. 3 saves. A surplus. Permission to take a risk. But the streak is a frame. The 3 patients were not deposits in a bank. Their survival was not a currency she could spend. The narrow frame converted 3 separate outcomes into a balance, and the balance told her she was ahead. She was not ahead. She was not behind. The ledger does not exist. But the feeling of being ahead, that feeling made the next decision for her. The frame changed everything, but she could not see the frame. She saw only the patient, the odds, the streak, and she trusted herself. She trusted her gut. She had 15 years. But 15 years of what? She trusted her gut. She had 15 years. But 15 years of what? Hold your answer. You had a feeling, a preference. The expert, because expertise should mean something. Or the formula, because numbers do not lie. Either way, the preference arrived before the argument. It always does. A lieutenant and his crew arrive at a routine kitchen fire. They enter the living room. They set up. They begin spraying water. The fire does not respond. The water hits the flames, and the flames continue as if the water is irrelevant. The lieutenant feels something he cannot name. A wordless discomfort. Something is wrong. He orders everyone out. Now. No explanation. They clear the living room. Seconds later, the floor collapses. The fire was not in the kitchen. It was in the basement. They had been standing on it. When the psychologist Gary Klein interviewed the lieutenant afterward, the lieutenant said it was extrasensory perception. He believed he had a sixth sense. Klein did not. Klein believed something more interesting. The lieutenant had been fighting fires for more than a decade. In that time, he had seen thousands of configurations, heat patterns, smoke behavior. The way flame moves through a structure. His gut feeling was not magic. It was a pattern his body recognized before his conscious mind could articulate it. The fire was too hot for a kitchen fire. The room was too quiet. The water was not working. These cues were available. He did not process them as data points. He processed them as a feeling. The feeling was correct, but the question this episode asks is not whether it was correct. The question is, when is it correct? And when is the same feeling, the same certainty, the same wordless authority, wrong? 15 years of experience. But not in this specific case. She did not meet the conditions for valid intuition. The environment was not regular enough. The feedback was not fast enough. Her confidence was real. Her expertise was not. Herbert Simon spent decades studying expertise. His definition of intuition was precise. The situation has provided a cue. This cue has given the expert access to information stored in memory, and the information provides the answer. Intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. A chess master has spent at least 10,000 hours in dedicated practice, roughly 6 years at 5 hours a day. In that time, the player becomes familiar with thousands of configurations. Learning chess, Simon argued, is like learning to read. The patterns of pieces on a board are like letters. A full position is like a long word or a sentence. The meaning arrives whole. Show a chess master a position from an actual game for 5 seconds. Remove it. Ask them to reconstruct it. They can place every piece. Show a novice the same position for the same 5 seconds. They place 4 or 5. The master is not remembering harder. The master is recognizing a pattern they have seen before. Gary Klein studied how fireground commanders made decisions under pressure. His initial hypothesis was that they would generate several options and compare them. He was wrong. The commanders generated a single option from a repertoire of patterns compiled during more than a decade of experience. Then they mentally simulated it. If the simulation revealed a problem, they modified the option or moved to the next one. But the first option was almost always the one they used. Klein called this the recognition-primed decision model. It was recognition, the same process Simon described in chess, but operating in smoke and noise and collapsing structures. The entire process felt, to the commander, like intuition, like knowing without thinking. And in these commanders, the intuition worked, because the environment met the conditions. Twas Brelig and the slithy Toves did jeer and gimble in the Waby. You pronounce those words correctly. They do not exist. But your reading system, trained over millions of words, recognized the patterns. Your mouth knew what to do with Sleethy before your mind could explain why. This is what 10,000 hours produces. Not a library of facts, a library of patterns. And the retrieval feels not like retrieval, but like knowing. The fire lieutenant felt the basement fire in his gut. The chess master sees the winning move without calculation. The skilled reader pronounces nonsense with perfect cadence. In every case, the mechanism is the same: recognition. A feeling that seems to come from nowhere. The question is not whether the feeling is real. The feeling is always real. The question is whether the recognition is valid. These are the two conditions for valid intuition. Both must be met. If either is absent, the intuition is an illusion, feels identical to the real thing. The first condition: a regular environment. Chess is regular. The rules do not change. Fire behavior is regular, not perfectly, but sufficiently. These environments have stable regularities that can be learned. Stock markets are not regular. Long-term political forecasting is not regular. In these environments, the expert develops patterns, but the patterns connect to noise. The learning is real. The lessons are false. Philip Tetlock spent decades measuring political judgment. The experts, with one big theory, the hedgehogs, made confident forecasts and did badly. The better forecasters were foxes, cautious, numeric, willing to update. The later super forecasters were not pure gut experts. They treated predictions as bets, tracked their errors, and revised when evidence arrived. They built a feedback system around an environment that gives almost none. The second condition: adequate, timely feedback. An anesthesiologist gets clear, fast feedback. If something goes wrong during surgery, the patient's vital signs change within seconds. A radiologist does not. The X-ray is read, the diagnosis is sent, but if a tumor is missed, the radiologist may never learn about it. The patient goes elsewhere. The error is invisible. The radiologist has experience, but the experience is mute. Psychotherapists fall in between. They develop genuine skill at reading patients' immediate emotional states. But they get sparse or no feedback on whether their long-term treatment predictions were right. They cannot distinguish their valid short-term intuitions from their invalid long-term forecasts. If an anesthesiologist says, "I have a feeling something is wrong," everyone in the operating room should be prepared for an emergency. If a stock picker says, "I have a feeling about this company," the feeling is worth nothing. Not because the stock picker is less intelligent, because the stock picker's environment does not hold still long enough to be learned. In the early 20th century, a physician developed an extraordinary reputation for diagnosing typhoid fever. He could examine a patient and know, with what seemed like clinical infallibility, whether the disease was present. His colleagues marveled. His patients trusted him. His track record was remarkable. His diagnostic method involved palpating the patient's tongue. He did not wash his hands between examinations. Patient after patient whom he examined subsequently developed typhoid. His predictions were accurate, but not because he was exercising professional intuition. He was spreading the disease. He palpated the tongue of a healthy patient, transferred the bacterium, and the patient fell ill, confirming his diagnosis. His confidence grew. His intuition became legendary. Robin Hogarth called this a wicked environment. Not wicked in the moral sense, wicked in the structural sense. An environment that provides feedback, but feedback that is systematically misleading. His environment did not teach him to recognize typhoid. It taught him to cause it and then recognize the consequences. From the inside, there was no difference between his expertise and the real thing. He had pattern recognition. He had confidence. He had a track record. The only thing he did not have was validity. In 1954, the psychologist Paul Meehl published a slim, devastating book. He reviewed 20 studies that compared to methods of prediction. The first method was clinical, trained professionals, interviewing subjects, reading files, forming impressions, and making predictions based on their experience and judgment. The second method was statistical. Simple formulas that combined a few variables with fixed weights and produced a number. The formulas won, not in specialized domains. Across the board, trained counselors predicted freshman grades after 45-minute interviews, with access to high school grades, aptitude tests, and 4-page personal statements. Formula using only grades, and one test score beat 11 of the 14 counselors. Meehl continued collecting evidence for the rest of his career. The cumulative record reached roughly 200 studies. Approximately 60% showed the algorithm significantly more accurate than the clinician. The rest were ties. A tie, Meehl noted, is tantamount to a win for the statistical method, since formulas are vastly cheaper than professionals. No convincing exception was ever documented. Not one. The reaction from clinicians was not curiosity, it was hostility. They described the clinical method as rich, deep, genuine, living, true to life. They described the statistical method as mechanical, dead, rigid, sterile, blind. The adjectives are the argument, not an argument about accuracy. An argument about identity. Meehl's ethical argument was blunt. It is unethical to rely on intuitive judgment when a formula is available that will make fewer mistakes. The story of a child who died because an algorithm made an error is more poignant than the story of the same child dying because of human error. But the algorithm kills fewer children. A study presented the same chest X-rays to experienced radiologists on 2 separate occasions, weeks apart. They contradicted their own previous readings 20% of the time. Not disagreement between different radiologists. Self-contradiction. 101 auditors showed the same pattern. A 41-study meta-review confirmed it is typical. The explanation is not incompetence. It is noise. Whether you read the X-ray before lunch or after, whether the previous case was alarming or routine, whether you slept well, the human judge is a measurement instrument, and the instrument drifts. A formula does not drift. This is not a virtue of intelligence. It is a virtue of consistency. Return to the question you were asked at the start. An economist named Orley Ashenfelter built a formula to predict the future price of Bordeaux wines. 3 weather measurements. Average summer temperature, rain at harvest, total rainfall the previous winter. No tasting, no swirling, no vocabulary of terroir and tannin. The correlation with actual prices was above 0.90. A prominent French wine critic said it was like judging movies without actually seeing them. The response, another observed, was somewhere between violent and hysterical. The critics were not defending their predictions. They were defending their identity as people who could taste what a formula could not. The formula did not merely outperform them. It humiliated them by suggesting that a thermometer and a rain gauge knew more than a lifetime of palate training. If you chose the expert at the start of this episode, you were not wrong to value expertise. You were wrong about what expertise is. Experience without a valid environment and timely feedback produces only confidence. And confidence without validity is the most dangerous kind of knowledge, because it feels exactly like the real thing. Robin Dawes proposed a formula for marital stability. Frequency of lovemaking minus frequency of quarrels. You do not want your result to be a negative number. The formula is a joke. It is also more accurate than most marriage counselors. Daniel Kahneman believed that expert intuition was, in most cases, an illusion. Gary Klein believed it was, in most cases, genuine. They had spent decades on opposite sides of the same question. They disagreed about nearly everything. Then they decided to write a paper together. It took 7 to 8 years, hundreds of emails, many drafts. It almost blew up more than once. They called it an adversarial collaboration, a term Kahneman had coined for the process of two intellectual opponents attempting to identify precisely where they agreed and where they did not. The results surprised them both. They published a joint paper with a title that confessed the outcome: Conditions for Intuitive Expertise, a Failure to Disagree. Not on the principles. They agreed on the two conditions. They agreed that intuition is genuine in regular environments with timely feedback and an illusion everywhere else. What they could not agree on was the emotional attitude. Klein still winces when the word bias is mentioned. Kahneman finds more pleasure than Klein does in the comeuppance of arrogant experts who do not know the limits of their competence. They agreed on the science. They disagreed on the mood. In 1955, Daniel Kahneman was a 21-year-old lieutenant in the Israeli Defense Forces. His bachelor's degree, he later noted, probably qualified him as the best-trained psychologist in the Army. He was assigned to evaluate whether the interview system used to screen recruits was working. It was not. The existing interviews lasted 15 to 20 minutes. They produced global impressions, gut feelings about the recruit's potential. The interviewers were confident. The predictions were almost useless. Kahneman redesigned the system. He selected 6 personality traits: responsibility, masculine pride, and 3 others. For each trait, he wrote standardized questions with specific, factual answers. The interviewers would score each trait on a 1 to 5 scale, based on the answers, not on their impression. The interviewers nearly mutinied. "You are turning us into robots." They protested that the new method stripped them of their professional skill, that it reduced the richness of human interaction to a checklist, that a person cannot be captured in 6 numbers. Kahneman listened. Then he offered a compromise. After completing the 6 standardized ratings, The interviewers would close their eyes, try to imagine the recruit as a soldier, and assign a final overall score based on their gut feeling. The results arrived. The structured interview was far more accurate than the old method, but the surprise was the close your eyes score. It performed just as well as the sum of the 6 traits. Not because the gut was magic, because the gut, disciplined by the structured interview, forced to attend to specific facts before being allowed to integrate, produced better intuitions than the gut left to its own devices. Kahneman's final formula gave equal weight to both the 6 trait sum and the closer eyes score. 45 years later, after receiving the Nobel Prize, Kahneman visited the same base. The system was still in use. The commanding officer walked him through the procedure, step by step. When she reached the final instruction, she smiled. And then we tell them, close your eyes. In 1953, a medical resident asked Virginia Apgar a question over breakfast. How would you make a systematic assessment of a newborn? Her answer was immediate. That's easy. You would do it like this. She grabbed a piece of paper. She wrote down 5 variables: heart rate, respiration, reflex irritability, muscle tone, and color. Each scored 0 to 2. A total of 8 or above meant the baby was in good shape. 4 or below meant immediate intervention was required. It took her less than a minute to design. It is still used in every delivery room in the world. The Apgar score replaces the global impression with a checklist. It does not require genius. It requires attention to 5 specific things, scored the same way regardless of who is scoring. Dawes's insight. An equal weight formula performs as well as one with statistically optimal weights. The Apgar score does not need to be tuned. It needs to be followed. When should you override the formula? Almost never. The broken leg rule. You override the algorithm only when you possess specific, decisive, rare information categorically outside its inputs. A broken leg. A death in the family. Broken legs are very rare, as well as decisive. The problem is that experts believe they encounter broken legs constantly. Every case feels special. Every stock feels like the exception, and accuracy drops. The rule is not, trust the expert when the expert feels confident. The rule is, evaluate the provenance. Was the environment regular? Was the feedback timely? If yes, the intuition is likely valid. If no, the intuition is noise that feels like signal. Do not trust anyone, including yourself, to tell you how much you should trust their judgment. Okay? The experts who are wrong are not less confident than the experts who are right. They are often more confident. They do not know the limits of their expertise, and the unrecognized limits help explain why they are so sure. Warren Harding was elected President of the United States in 1920. He was tall, square-jawed, and handsome, the perfect image of a strong and decisive leader. The American public looked at him and saw a precedent. They answered the wrong question. Not will he be a good leader, but does he look like one? The substitution was invisible. The feeling of confidence was genuine. He is consistently ranked among the worst presidents in American history. Now consider the Kouros, the ancient Greek sculpture that arrived at the Getty Museum. Art experts examined it and felt, in their gut, that something was wrong. They could not articulate why. One expert felt a wave of intuitive repulsion. Another simply knew it was not right. They turned out to be correct. The sculpture was a forgery. Both feelings, the feeling about Harding, the feeling about the Kouros, arrived the same way, as a gut response, as a wordless conviction, as expertise expressing itself without explanation. One was valid, one was not, and from the inside, they were identical. Return to the hospital. She has 15 years of experience. She has treated hundreds of patients. She has a feeling about this one, a conviction that arrives without deliberation, a certainty that feels earned. Her gut says she knows. but her environment was not regular enough. The patterns she learned were not stable. They shifted with each protocol change, each new drug, each population variation. And her feedback was not fast enough. The outcomes arrived weeks or months later, filtered through other departments, other doctors, other records. She learned, but what she learned may not have been the right lessons. Her confidence is indistinguishable from the fire lieutenant's. Her feeling is the same as the chess master's. Her certainty sounds exactly like the anesthesiologist's. But the conditions were not met. The environment was not regular. The feedback was not timely. And she cannot tell the difference, because from the inside, there is no difference to tell. Valid intuition and invalid intuition feel the same. She felt one. The environment did not confirm which. She decided anyway. But there was a patient who lived through it, and a patient who died. Which one does she remember? There was a patient who lived through it, and a patient who died. Which one does she remember? Hold your answer. Some of you said it would greatly reduce the value. Some of you said you would not bother going at all. And a few of you, a very few, noticed the question you were actually answering. Not, would the vacation be enjoyable? But, would it matter? A man told Kahneman about a wonderful experience. He had been listening to a long symphony on a recording. The music was glorious. 20 minutes of it. 30. The performance was extraordinary, and then, near the very end, a hideous scratching sound. The man said it ruined the whole experience. But it had not. The experience was almost entirely good. 20 minutes of glorious music, lived and felt. What was destroyed was not the experience. It was the memory of the experience. And the man could not tell them apart. She chose. That much we know. We have watched the decision build across 10 episodes. We have seen the cognitive load, the halo effect, the framing, the anchoring, the loss aversion, the invalid intuition. We understood why the choice was made, the way it was made. Episode 10 ended with a question. There was a patient who lived through it, and a patient who died. Which one does she remember? The answer is not a name. She remembers the peak. She remembers the ending. She remembers the case in the only form memory can carry. But there was something we did not see. There were 2 patients in that decision, but there were also 2 doctors. The one who stood in the corridor and felt it, and the one who walked away and remembered it. One case was long and ugly, but ended with breath returning and machines quieting down. The other was shorter, cleaner, almost merciful, but ended with a death. Later, when she thinks about what happened, the total suffering is not what comes back first. The hours do not come back. The base rates do not come back. What comes back is intensity, then ending. The experiencing self suffered. The remembering self rewrote the story. And the next time the doctor stands at a door, that story will arrive dressed as evidence. She cannot tell which self made the choice. In the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham placed a wager on the nature of human life. He declared that nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They alone, he argued, determine what we shall do, what we will do. He called the capacity to experience pleasure and pain experienced utility. It was, for Bentham, the foundation of morality, of law, of everything that mattered. A century later, the economist Francis Edgeworth took Bentham seriously enough to propose a device. He called it a hedonimeter, an instrument that would measure pleasure and pain at every moment, plotted as a function of time. The total utility of an experience would be the area under the curve. Every instant counted. Every moment of joy or suffering, weighted equally, summed into a final accounting. The hedonimeter was never built. But it established the premise: the unit of well-being is the moment, and a life is the sum of its moments. For 200 years, economics proceeded as if this were true. It is not. 154 patients undergoing colonoscopy reported their pain every 60 seconds on a scale of 0 to 10. The shortest procedure lasted 4 minutes. The longest lasted 69 minutes. Every moment was recorded. The head emitter, finally, existed. Patient A endured 8 minutes. Peak pain, 8. Final pain, 7. Patient B endured 24 minutes. Peak pain, 8. Final pain, 1. Patient B suffered far more. 3 times the duration, a vastly larger area under the curve. Patient A retained the worst memory. The retrospective ratings were predicted almost perfectly by 2 things: the peak intensity and the intensity at the end. Nothing else mattered. Not the duration. Not the total. Not the area under the curve. Kahneman and Rettelmeyer called this the peak end rule. And they named the companion finding duration neglect. The length of the procedure, whether it lasted 4 minutes or 69, had no effect whatsoever on how patients remembered it. Bentham's entire framework collapsed on a hospital table. The experiencing self had endured every minute. The remembering self kept only the peak and the end. The cold hand experiment. Participants held one hand in painfully cold water under 2 conditions. Both were unpleasant. Both were real. The short episode, 60 seconds at 14 degrees Celsius. Painful throughout. At the end, the hand was removed. The long episode, 90 seconds. The first 60 seconds were identical, 14 degrees, the same pain. But then, a valve was opened, allowing slightly warmer water into the basin. Over the additional 30 seconds, the temperature rose by roughly 1 degree. Still painful. Still below comfort. But trending, barely, toward relief. The trials were separated by 7 minutes. After experiencing both, participants were told they would repeat one of the 2 episodes. They were asked to choose. 80% of participants who noticed the decrease chose the longer episode. 30 additional seconds of needless pain, voluntarily accepted, because the memory of the longer episode was better. The ending improved. The memory was kinder. And the memory made the choice. They chose more pain. Because the remembering self, the self that evaluates and decides, does not count minutes. It reads endings. Even rats show duration neglect for electric shock. Only intensity matters. The rules of the remembering self have a long evolutionary history. The implication for medicine: if the goal is to reduce the memory of pain, lower peak intensity, and ensure gradual relief at the end. If the goal is to reduce actual pain, conduct the procedure swiftly, even if the peak is higher. The 2 goals serve different selves. Confusing experience with the memory of it is a compelling cognitive illusion. The psychologist Ed Diener constructed a fictional character named Jen. She was never married. She had no children. She died instantly and painlessly in an automobile accident. Her life, in every version of the story, was described as extremely happy. She enjoyed her work. She took vacations. She spent time with friends. Participants were given one of 2 versions. In the first, Jen lived to be 30. In the second, she lived to 60. The question: how desirable was her life? Doubling the duration of Jen's happy life had no effect on desirability ratings. 30 years of happiness and 60 years of happiness were judged equally desirable. Then Diener added a condition. A third version of Jen, in which she lived the same extremely happy life, but then had 5 additional years that were pleasant but less so. She was still content, still enjoying life, but not quite as joyful as before. 5 extra years of reasonably good living, added to a life of great happiness. Adding 5 slightly happy years substantially dropped the desirability ratings, not by a small amount, substantially. Even when participants saw both versions, the original and the extended, the intuition was, in Kahneman's words, overwhelming. He did not believe that reasonable people could say that adding 5 slightly happy years to a wonderful life would make the life substantially worse. He was wrong. A life, to the remembering self, is not a sum of moments. It is a story. And a story has a shape. Adding 5 slightly less happy years did not add to the story. It diluted the ending. It turned a story of unbroken joy into a story of decline. The arithmetic was positive, more happy years, more total happiness. But the narrative was worse. A story is about significant events and memorable moments, not about time passing. Duration neglect is normal in a story. And the remembering self is a storyteller. Violetta is dying of consumption. Her lover arrives. They sing 10 minutes of glorious music. She dies. Kahneman asked himself, why do we care so much about those last 10 minutes? He realized he did not care whether Violetta died at 28. Losing a full year of happy life would not have moved him. But the final 10 minutes mattered a great deal. Because Violetta is a character in a story, and in a story, the ending is the meaning. Duration is irrelevant. What matters is the shape. A divorce is like a symphony with a screeching sound at the end. The fact that it ended badly does not mean it was all bad, but the remembering self does not agree. To the remembering self, a bad ending contaminates everything that preceded it. 30 years of marriage, recounted as a failure. An inconsistency is built into the design of our minds. Imagine a vacation. 2 weeks in a place you have always wanted to visit. You will experience every moment, the food, the light, the beauty, the rest. But at the end, all photographs and videos will be destroyed. And you will swallow a drug that erases every memory of the trip. You will not remember going. You will not know it happened. Would you still go? Most people say it greatly reduces the value. Some say they would not bother going at all. Nobody, Kahneman noted, would send an amnesic on a vacation to climb mountains or trek through jungles. The effort is meaningless without the memory. The experience, stripped of its record, becomes expendable. Now consider the reverse. A painful surgical operation while fully conscious. You will scream. You will beg the surgeon to stop. But afterward, an amnesia drug erases every trace of the experience. You will not remember any of it. Most people are, in Kahneman's words, remarkably indifferent to the pains of their experiencing self. The surgery without memory is tolerable. The vacation without memory is not worth taking. He reflected. I feel pity for my suffering self, but not more than I would feel for a stranger in pain. I am my remembering self, and the experiencing self, who does my living, is like a stranger to me. The photographer does not view the scene as a moment to be savored but as a future memory to be designed. A study of spring break vacationers confirmed the pattern. Students maintained daily diaries throughout the trip, then a global rating at the end. Their intentions for future vacations were entirely determined by the final evaluation, even when it did not match the diary data. The experiencing self kept notes. The remembering self made the plans. The Gallup Healthways Well-Being Index collected over 450,000 responses, one of the largest studies of well-being ever conducted. It measured 2 things separately. Experienced well-being, how people feel as they live their lives, moment to moment, day to day. And life satisfaction, how people evaluate their lives when they stop to think about it. Income affected both, but not the same way. Experienced well-being rose steadily with income up to approximately $75,000. Above that threshold, the average increase was precisely 0. Higher income did not make the day feel better, But life satisfaction, the judgment people make when they pause and ask how their life is going, continued to rise with income well beyond $75,000. Being rich did not improve the experience, but it improved the story. The experiencing self plateaued. The remembering self kept climbing. Severe poverty amplified misfortune. Among the poorest tenth of the population, a headache increased. Reports of sadness from 38% to 70%. Among the top third, the same headache increased sadness from 19% to 38%. Poverty does not merely reduce happiness. It makes every bad event worse. Happiness, Kahneman concluded, is the experience of spending time with people you love and who love you. The easiest way to increase happiness is to control your use of time. Neither of these observations requires an income above $75,000. Students at major state universities in California and the Midwest were asked about their overall life satisfaction. They were also asked how satisfied they believed students in the other region were. There was no difference in reported life satisfaction between Californians and Midwesterners. None. But both groups, including the Californians themselves, believed that Californians were happier. The climate was better in California, but climate is not what determines life satisfaction. When asked about happiness, however, everyone thought of weather, because weather is the salient difference. And when you think about a difference, you overweight it. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. Kahneman called this the focusing illusion. When you think about any single factor in your life, your income, your health, your climate, your marriage, you exaggerate its importance, because the act of thinking about it makes it salient, and salience is the raw material of judgment. Norbert Schwartz demonstrated this with a dime. Students who found a dime on a photocopying machine, placed there by the experimenter, reported markedly higher satisfaction with their life as a whole. A dime. Their entire life. The dime was on their mind. And what is on your mind, when you are asked about your life, becomes your answer. Studies of colostomy patients found no difference in experienced happiness compared to the healthy population. Their moment-to-moment emotions, the data from experience sampling, the actual texture of daily life, were indistinguishable from those of people without colostomies. But when asked to evaluate their condition, when asked to think about it, they reported that they would trade years of their life to reverse the surgery. Years of a life that was, by every experiential measure, as happy as anyone else's. The remembering self is subject to a massive focusing illusion. When you think about living with a colostomy, you think about the colostomy. You do not think about the other 23 hours of the day in which you are not thinking about it. The colostomy dominates the evaluation because the evaluation directs attention to it, but it does not dominate the experience. Because in the experience, you are mostly thinking about other things. Paraplegics showed a similar pattern. Those who knew a paraplegic estimated they would be in a bad mood 41% of the time after 1 year. Those who did not know one estimated 68%. The actual data showed that paraplegics were in a fairly good mood more than half the time, as early as 1 month after the accident. Paraplegia is not one of the exceptions to adaptation. But people believe it is, because when they think about paraplegia, they can think of nothing else. How much pleasure do you get from your car? You answered a different question. How much pleasure from your car when you think about it? You rarely think about the car while driving. The car is a frame, not an experience. German panel data tracked couples through the years surrounding marriage. Life satisfaction peaked at the wedding and declined steeply back to baseline. Not because the marriage worsened, because the marriage stopped being salient. The marriage did not change. The attention did. Day reconstruction methods studies asked 1,000 American women to relive their previous day as a series of episodes, like scenes in a film. The results were compiled into a U-index, the percentage of time spent in an unpleasant state. For American women, 19%. For French women, 16%. For Danish women, 14%. The biggest surprise was about children. Time spent on childcare was rated as slightly less enjoyable than time spent on housework. The commute scored highest on the unpleasantness index at 29%. Sex scored lowest at 5%. The findings were not about whether people loved their children. They did. The findings were about moment-to-moment experience. And moment-to-moment, children are demanding, exhausting, and frequently unpleasant, no matter how much the remembering self cherishes them. The word Kahneman borrowed from Daniel Gilbert and Timothy Wilson was miswanting. Bad choices that arise from errors of effective forecasting, predicting what will make you happy and being wrong. This word, Kahneman wrote, deserves to be in everyday language, because the remembering self is the one doing the predicting, and the experiencing self is the one who has to live with the prediction. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. The mind is good with stories, but it does not appear to be well designed for the processing of time. Return to the hospital. She experienced the decision. She stood in the corridor and felt the weight of it. The exhaustion, the fear, the adrenaline, the fluorescent hum of a place that never sleeps. That was real. That happened. Every second of it lived. And then she walked away. And the remembering self took over. It selected the peak, the moment of greatest intensity. It selected the end, the outcome. It discarded the duration. It shaped what happened into a story. And the story is what she carries. The experiencing self cannot speak. It has no voice. It does not get to testify. The remembering self tells the story, evaluates the life, and makes the next decision. The experiencing self, who does the living, is like a stranger. The patient who lived through it and the patient who died, both were experienced. Both were real. But the doctor will carry only the story, peak and the end. The rest, the hours, the minutes, the 60-second intervals of pain or hope will be duration elected. They will not factor into the next decision. They never do. This is how the future bends. Not toward the full record. Not toward the sum of suffering and relief. Toward the case with the memorable peak. Toward the ending that can be told. She cannot tell which self made the choice, because she has never known there were two. You have been watching. You remember the peaks and the endings. You have duration neglected the rest. 11 episodes. You remember the bat and ball problem. You remember the gorilla. You remember the Israeli judges and the dime on the machine and the cold hand and the scratch on the symphony. You remember the moments that surprised you. You do not remember the transitions. You do not remember the pauses. You do not remember the minutes between the experiments. Your remembering self has been editing the series, selecting the peaks, weighting the endings, discarding the duration, exactly as it edits your life. You've been watching this series the way you watch your own life. And you did not notice